The mail-order bride contract wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and Evelyn Hart discovered that truth in the middle of a Colorado general store, surrounded by strangers who watched her dreams shatter like dropped china. The man who'd promised her everything stood 3 feet away, refusing to even meet her eyes. She had $23, one trunk, and no ticket home to Boston. What she didn't know was that the most dangerous man in Red Willow was watching from the corner, and he was about to make her an offer that would either save her life or ruin what was left of her reputation. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Evelyn's story travels. Hit that like button, and let's dive into a tale of broken promises and unexpected redemption in the Wild West. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in front of Miller's General Store, sending up a cloud of red Colorado dust that settled on Evelyn Hart's navy traveling dress like a fine layer of disappointment. She'd been watching that dust for 3 days, coating the windows, seeping through every crack in the coach, working its way into her hair and her hopes with equal persistence. Now, as she stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk of Red Willow, that same dust seemed to announce her arrival to a town that looked nothing like the photographs Thomas Garrett had sent. The letters had described a thriving frontier community with tree-lined streets and whitewashed churches. The reality was a collection of weathered buildings slouching against each other like weary travelers, connected by muddy streets that turned to rivers when it rained and dust bowls when it didn't. The April sun beat down with surprising intensity for spring, and Evelyn felt sweat beginning to gather beneath her high collar despite the mountain air's lingering chill. "Miss Hart?" The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd spent 3 days pointedly not making conversation, finally addressed her directly. "This is your stop, Red Willow." "Thank you." Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd practiced this moment 100 times during the journey west. The graceful arrival, the dignified greeting, the careful balance between eagerness and propriety that a well-bred Boston woman should maintain even at the edge of civilization. Pete hauled her trunk down from the coach roof with a grunt. It landed on the boardwalk with a thud that seemed too loud, too final. Everything she owned that mattered, her books, her mother's silver brush, 3 good dresses, and the carefully folded wedding gown she'd spent 2 months sewing by lamplight, was in that trunk, her entire future reduced to something a single man could barely lift. "Need help getting that inside?" Pete asked, but he was already climbing back up to the driver's seat, clearly eager to finish his route before sundown. "I'll manage." Evelyn straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirts, trying to ignore the way several passers-by had slowed their steps to stare. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough. A woman traveling alone with a trunk that size, clearly arriving to stay, was the kind of spectacle that stopped traffic in a town this small. The general store's door stood open, and through it Evelyn could see the dim interior crowded with goods, barrels and crates, shelves lined with canned provisions, hanging tools and harnesses. Somewhere in there, Thomas Garrett was supposed to be waiting. According to his last letter, received 3 weeks ago in Boston, he would meet her stage, collect her trunk, and escort her to the small house he'd prepared for their married life. Evelyn had read that letter so many times the paper had worn soft at the creases. "My dear Miss Hart, I count the days until your arrival with great anticipation. I have made every preparation for your comfort and happiness in our new home. You will find Red Willow a place where a woman of your education and refinement can build a meaningful life. I remain, with deepest respect and affection, Thomas Garrett." The words had seemed so sincere. The previous letters had been even warmer, full of descriptions of the mountains, the opportunities for an educated woman to contribute to a growing community, the loneliness of a man building a future with no one to share it. Thomas had written about teaching positions at the new schoolhouse, about the library he was helping establish, about evenings spent reading by the fire and Sunday socials where she would meet the other respectable families of Red Willow. None of those letters had prepared her for the silence that greeted her when she stepped into Miller's General Store. The interior was darker than she'd expected, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust from the bright street outside. When they did, she saw a long counter running along one wall, shelves stacked to the ceiling with dry goods, and a cluster of men near a pot-bellied stove despite the warmth of the day. The conversation that had been rumbling through the space died the instant she entered. "I'm looking for Thomas Garrett," Evelyn said, directing her words to the man behind the counter. Middle-aged, balding, with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd been measuring customers for profit his entire life. "I'm Evelyn Hart, from Boston. I believe he's expecting me." The silence that followed her announcement felt different from the usual quiet that greeted a stranger. This was weighted, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that preceded bad news. The men by the stove exchanged glances. Someone coughed. The shopkeeper, Miller, she assumed, set down the ledger he'd been writing in with deliberate care. "Thomas Garrett," he repeated, as if the name needed consideration. "You're the one he sent for, then." Something in his tone made Evelyn's stomach tighten. "We've been corresponding for 6 months. He invited me to come to Red Willow to—" She hesitated, suddenly aware of the watching eyes, the listening ears. "To begin a new life." "I'm sure he did." A new voice cut through the tension, and Evelyn turned to find its source. The man who stepped forward from the shadows near the far wall was not Thomas Garrett. Evelyn knew that instantly, though she'd never seen a photograph of her intended husband. Thomas had apologized in his letters for his inability to have a portrait made. The nearest photographer was in Denver, he'd explained, a 3-day journey not easily undertaken during the busy ranching season. This man was tall, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore range clothes, dusty denim, a leather vest, a bandana knotted loosely at his throat, but something about the way he carried himself suggested he was accustomed to authority. The men by the stove shifted when he moved, a subtle deference that spoke louder than words. "You must be Miss Hart." His voice was rough-edged but not unkind. "I'm Caleb Reed. I own the Triple R, north of town." Evelyn nodded politely, confused about why a local rancher was introducing himself, but relieved to have someone address her directly. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Reed. I'm afraid I'm looking for Thomas Garrett." "Yes, I heard." Caleb Reed's expression was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that made Evelyn's unease deepen. "He's not here, Miss Hart." "Not here?" The words didn't make sense. "But I sent a telegram from Cheyenne 3 days ago. He knew exactly when I was arriving." "I'm sure he did." Miller spoke up from behind the counter, his tone carrying an edge Evelyn couldn't quite interpret. "Question is whether he planned to be here for it." "I don't understand." Evelyn heard her own voice rising, felt the careful composure she'd maintained for 3 days of dusty travel beginning to crack. "We have an arrangement. A contract. He sent money for my passage. He got married last week," Caleb Reed said quietly. "To Sarah Brennan, the hotel owner's daughter." The words landed like physical blows. Evelyn felt the room tilt, felt the careful future she'd constructed collapsing around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. "That's not possible. He wrote to me. He invited me here. He sent for a mail-order bride while he was courting a local girl." Miller's voice carried no sympathy. "Kept his options open, I'd say. Sarah came with a dowry, the hotel and the land it sits on. You came with what, exactly?" The cruelty of the question struck Evelyn speechless. She was aware, suddenly and acutely, of every eye in the store fixed on her, of the whispers that would spread through Red Willow before sundown, of the trunk sitting outside on the boardwalk containing everything she owned, 3,000 miles from the only home she'd ever known. "That's enough, Miller." Caleb Reed's voice cut sharp as a blade through the thick air. "The lady's not on trial here." "Lady?" One of the men by the stove spoke up, emboldened by the shopkeeper's mockery. "She's a mail-order bride who got herself shipped west for nothing. That makes her—" "Careful." Caleb didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made the speaker swallow his next words. "Real careful about what you say next." Evelyn wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that she wasn't some desperate woman seeking any man who'd have her, that Thomas's letters had been thoughtful and kind, that he'd represented himself as an educated man seeking an educated wife for genuine companionship. But the words stuck in her throat, because how could she make these strangers understand what she barely understood herself? 6 months ago, her life in Boston had been comfortable enough. She'd lived with her aunt following her parents' deaths from typhoid, worked as a music teacher for the children of wealthy families, attended church socials and literary circles. It should have been sufficient. It would have been, if not for the slow, creeping realization that she was becoming invisible, a permanent fixture in her aunt's household, the spinster niece who would never leave, never change, never become anything more than a polite shadow in someone else's life. Thomas's first letter had arrived like a door opening in a wall she'd thought was solid. He'd written to her initially at the suggestion of a mutual acquaintance, a man who'd known her father and believed Evelyn's education would suit a frontier town in need of teachers. The correspondence had been cautious at first, formal, but gradually it had warmed into something that felt like possibility. Thomas had needed a wife. Evelyn had needed a purpose. It had seemed like providence, not desperation. Now, standing in Miller's general store with her entire life reduced to entertainment for strangers, Evelyn felt the weight of her mistake crushing down on her shoulders. Where is he? She forced the question out, needing to hear it from Thomas himself, needing to understand how 6 months of letters and promises could evaporate like morning mist. Where is Thomas Garrett right now? Took his new bride to Denver for a honeymoon trip, Miller said, clearly enjoying the disclosure. Won't be back for 2 weeks at least. 2 weeks. Evelyn's mind raced through impossible calculations. She had $23 left from the money Thomas had sent for her passage. She'd spent the rest on the journey itself, on meals at way stations, on a night in a Cheyenne hotel when the stage schedule had gone awry. $23 might buy her a week at a boarding house if Red Willow had such a thing, but then what? The return journey to Boston would cost at least $50, probably more. She had no family to wire for funds. Her aunt had made it clear that leaving for Colorado was burning a bridge, that Evelyn shouldn't expect welcome if she came crawling back. Is there a hotel? She asked the question to no one in particular, to anyone who might take pity enough to answer. Or a boarding house? Somewhere I might stay while I make arrangements? Hotel's full up. Miller's response came too quickly, as if he'd been waiting for the question. Ranch hands in town for the cattle auction. Won't have rooms for at least a week. It was a lie. Evelyn knew it was a lie from the satisfied gleam in the shopkeeper's eyes, from the way the men by the stove smirked into their coffee. But she had no way to challenge it, no authority to demand the truth in a town where she was not only a stranger, but an embarrassment. The woman stupid enough to travel across a continent for a man who didn't want her. I see. Evelyn heard her own voice from a great distance, remarkably steady for a woman watching her life crumble. Then I'll need to make other arrangements. Perhaps there's a stage heading back east this week. Next eastbound stage comes through Friday, Pete called from the doorway where he'd been watching the entire exchange with undisguised fascination. 3 days from now. Fare to Cheyenne is $12. From there, you'd need to arrange your own passage to wherever you're heading. $12 to Cheyenne. Another $40 to Boston, at minimum. Evelyn had $23 total, and no way to earn more in a town that was already marking her as a scandalous failure. The mathematics of her situation spelled out a simple, brutal truth. She was stranded. Miss Hart, Caleb Reed's voice broke through her calculations. Could I speak with you outside for a moment? Evelyn looked at him, this stranger who'd been the only person in the store to show her even a shred of courtesy, and found herself nodding. Anything was better than standing in front of these mocking men while she tried to figure out how to survive the next 3 days, let alone the next 3 months. She followed him out onto the boardwalk, grateful for the fresh air and the relative privacy of the street. Her trunk still sat where Pete had left it, and Evelyn found herself staring at it, that physical embodiment of her ruined plans, while she waited for Caleb Reed to speak. I'm sorry about what happened in there. He spoke quietly, his back to the store's open door. Miller's got a mean streak, and some of those men have too much time and too little sense. They weren't wrong, though. Evelyn surprised herself with the admission. I am exactly what they said. A mail-order bride who got shipped west for nothing. You're a woman who was lied to, Caleb corrected firmly. There's a difference. Evelyn looked at him properly for the first time. Really looked. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, lined around the eyes in a way that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. His hands, resting loosely on his belt, were scarred and calloused, working hands that knew labor and didn't shy from it. Everything about him suggested competence, steadiness, the kind of solid reliability that Thomas Garrett's flowery letters had promised, but clearly never possessed. Why are you being kind to me? The question slipped out before Evelyn could stop it. You don't know me. You have no reason to involve yourself in my situation. I have plenty of reason. Caleb's jaw tightened. I knew Thomas Garrett was corresponding with a woman back east. Heard him bragging about it in this very store 3 months ago. Then I saw him courting Sarah Brennan, saw him propose to her, saw him act like he'd never made promises to anyone else. I asked him about it directly, asked him what he planned to do about the woman he'd invited west. You know what he said? Evelyn shook her head, not trusting her voice. He said it was a business arrangement that fell through, that you'd understand being a sensible woman, that he'd write you a letter explaining the situation and you'd make other plans. Caleb's voice carried an edge of anger now. He didn't write that letter, did he? No. The word came out barely above a whisper. His last letter said he was counting the days until my arrival. Son of a... Caleb cut himself off, visibly restraining whatever he'd been about to say. That's what I thought. He left you hanging, let you come all this way, figured you'd show up and be someone else's problem. And now I am. Evelyn felt a hysterical laugh building in her chest. Someone else's problem. Only there doesn't seem to be anyone willing to take on the problem of a stranded mail-order bride with $23 and nowhere to go. $23? Caleb's eyebrows rose. That's all you have left? Thomas sent $50 for the journey. I was very careful with it, but the passage itself, meals, necessities. Evelyn trailed off, humiliated by the admission. I didn't expect to need money for lodging once I arrived. You thought you'd be starting your married life, Caleb finished quietly. Of course you did. Any reasonable person would have thought the same. They stood in silence for a moment, and Evelyn became aware of faces in the store windows, people slowing their steps to watch. The whisper of gossip already spreading through red willow like wildfire through dry grass. By tomorrow, everyone would know her story. By next week, it would be a cautionary tale. The foolish Eastern woman who trusted a man's promises and got exactly what she deserved. I have a proposition. Caleb's words pulled her attention back to him. Hear me out before you answer. Evelyn's stomach clenched. She'd heard about propositions offered to stranded women in frontier towns, about the kind of desperate bargains that respectable society pretended not to see. Mr. Reed, I appreciate your concern, but I need a housekeeper, he interrupted, and the simple statement was so unexpected that Evelyn's rehearsed refusal died on her lips. Someone to manage my household, oversee meals, handle the domestic side of running a working ranch. I've been managing with ranch hands who can barely boil water and a rotating series of local women who come when they feel like it and leave when something better comes along. I need someone reliable, someone educated enough to handle accounts and correspondence, someone who won't be scandalized by the rough nature of ranch life. Evelyn stared at him, trying to parse whether this was genuine or simply a more palatable version of the proposition she'd feared. You're offering me employment. I'm offering you a position, room and board, and wages that would let you save enough for passage east if that's what you decide you want. Caleb met her eyes steadily. Or enough to build a life here, if you find Colorado suits you better than you expected. Why? The question came out sharp, almost accusatory. You don't know me. I could be completely incompetent. I could be a thief. You could be all those things, Caleb agreed. But I don't think you are. Woman who spends 2 months sewing her own wedding dress by lamplight isn't looking to take shortcuts or make trouble. Woman who corresponds for 6 months with a man she's never met, builds a thoughtful connection through letters, isn't looking for easy answers. And woman who stands straight-backed in Miller's store while men mock her to her face has the kind of spine I can respect. How do you know about the wedding dress? Evelyn felt heat rising to her cheeks. Or the lamplight? Your hands. Caleb nodded toward where she'd been unconsciously rubbing her right thumb, calloused from months of needlework, against her palm. Seamstress hands, and your eyes. You squint a little when you look at things close up, the way people do when they've spent too many nights working by insufficient light. My mother was the same way. The observation was so specific, so perceptive, that Evelyn found herself momentarily speechless. Thomas Garrett had written her dozens of letters and never noticed anything about her beyond what she chose to tell him. This stranger had read more truth in 5 minutes than her intended husband had discovered in 6 months. I don't know anything about running a ranch household, she admitted, falling back on practical objections when emotional ones felt too dangerous. I was a music teacher in Boston. I know how to plan a menu for a dinner party and manage household accounts, but I've never cooked for ranch hands or dealt with the kinds of situations that must arise in this kind of environment. Can you cook at all? Yes. My mother taught me before she died. I'm not expert, but I'm competent. Can you read and write, handle numbers, keep ledgers organized? Of course. I studied at Miss Porter's school before my parents passed. Mathematics, literature, natural sciences. Then you know more than most women I could hire out here, Caleb said practically. The rest you'll learn as you go. I'll pay you $30 a month, more if you prove as capable as I think you will be. That's a good wage for this territory. You could save most of it if you're careful. $30 a month. In 4 months, Evelyn could save enough for passage back to Boston with money to spare for starting over. In 6 months, she could have options she'd never dreamed of in her aunt's house. If she could survive 6 months on a working ranch, working for a man she didn't know, in a town that already considered her a scandal, what would people say? The question emerged before Evelyn could stop it. I arrive in town as Thomas Garrett's intended bride, get rejected publicly, and leave immediately with another man? The gossip would be vicious, Caleb agreed bluntly. It'll be vicious anyway, Miss Hart. Garrett saw to that when he left you stranded. Question is whether you want to be vicious gossip starving in a town that won't help you, or vicious gossip earning honest wages and building toward a future. He had a point. Evelyn looked down at her trunk again, at the dusty street, at the faces still watching from store windows and doorways. She thought about her aunt's parting words. You're making a mistake, Evelyn. Mark my words. You'll come back begging, and don't expect me to take you in. And felt something harden in her chest. She hadn't come 3,000 miles to beg. Not from her aunt, not from Thomas Garrett, and not from the good people of Red Willow, Colorado. What would the arrangement be exactly? Evelyn heard herself asking. Specific duties? Living conditions? Expectations? You'd have your own room in the main house, Caleb said, clearly prepared for the question. Private quarters separate from the ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. You'd manage meals for myself and whatever hands are working at the time, usually 4 to 6 men, sometimes more during busy seasons. You'd handle household accounts, correspondence, ordering supplies, maintaining the domestic spaces, basic housekeeping, cleaning, laundry, mending. Nothing you wouldn't be doing as a married woman anyway, just with wages at the end of each month instead of vows at the beginning. Evelyn's practical mind was already calculating, cooking 3 meals a day for up to 7 people, managing household accounts, maintaining a ranch house, and probably doing laundry for working men who came in covered in dirt, and worse. It would be exhausting work, harder than anything she'd done in Boston, but it would be her work, her wages, her choice. What about propriety? She forced herself to ask the question that every watching townsperson would be asking. A single woman living in a house with a single man. I'm widowed, not single, Caleb corrected quietly. Lost my wife 3 years ago. The town knows I've been trying to find reliable household help since then. They won't like it, won't like you, but they can't claim it's improper when half the ranches in this valley have housekeepers living on the property. But those housekeepers weren't rejected mail-order brides arriving on the same stage that brought their humiliation. No, Caleb agreed. They weren't, which means you'll be working twice as hard to prove yourself half as respectable as any of them. That's not fair, Miss Hart, but it's the truth of your situation. Evelyn appreciated his honesty even as it stung. She looked at him again, this steady, practical man who'd stepped forward when no one else would, who offered employment instead of charity, who seemed to understand exactly how precarious her position was. Why are you really doing this? She asked the question quietly, needing to understand his motivation before she could trust his offer. The truth, Mr. Reed. Not the story about needing a housekeeper. You've managed for 3 years without me. Why now? Why me? Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that suggested old pain carefully managed. My wife came west with her family when she was 16. They promised her a new life, opportunities, all the things people promise when they want you to take a leap of faith into unknown territory. When they got here, Her father had gambled away most of their money. They were stranded, just like you are now. She was taken in by a family that needed help, treated like a servant in all but name. She was still living like that when I met her, still trying to earn enough to change her circumstances. He paused, his jaw tight. Sarah was the kindest person I ever knew. She never let bitterness poison her, never stopped believing things would get better. But she shouldn't have had to fight that hard just to survive, just because someone else broke their promises. When I saw you standing in that store, hearing Miller and those men treat you like entertainment, it was like watching Sarah all over again. I can't fix what happened to her, but I can make sure you don't end up the same way. The raw honesty of the answer settled something in Evelyn's chest. This wasn't about her specifically. She understood that. She was a stand-in for a dead woman's suffering, a chance for Caleb Reed to correct an old wrong that still haunted him. Some women might have been offended by that. Evelyn found it reassuring. He wasn't offering help because he wanted something from her. He was offering it because he couldn't stand to watch history repeat itself. That at least she could trust. "I'll need my trunk brought to your ranch," she said, and watched Caleb's expression shift as he understood she was accepting. "And I'll need to know what supplies you have on hand, what your normal schedule is for meals, whether there are any dietary restrictions or preferences among your ranch hands. I'll also need to understand the household budget and have authority to order necessary supplies from town merchants." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen from anyone since arriving in Red Willow. "Those are all reasonable requests. We can discuss details on the ride out to the ranch." "And Mr. Reed?" Evelyn straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of watching eyes but refusing to let them make her small. "I'm accepting this as a business arrangement, employment, nothing more. I hope that's clear." "Crystal clear, Miss Hart." Caleb's tone was respectful, professional. "You have my word as a gentleman and a widower. Your position in my household will be exactly what I said. Housekeeper, with fair wages and proper respect. Nothing more, nothing less." Evelyn nodded, then turned to look back at Miller's General Store, where faces were pressed against the windows watching their exchange. Let them watch. Let them gossip. She'd survived her parents' deaths, survived her aunt's cold charity, survived 3,000 miles of dusty travel only to have her hopes shattered in a frontier store. She could survive whatever Red Willow wanted to throw at her next. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Reed." She extended her hand, the gesture formal and binding. "When do I start?" Caleb shook her hand firmly, his grip warm and calloused and somehow reassuring. "Right now. I'll get my wagon, load your trunk, and we'll head out before this crowd finds something new to stare at." He was true to his word. Within 15 minutes, he'd brought a sturdy ranch wagon around, loaded Evelyn's trunk with an ease that suggested significant strength hidden beneath his work clothes, and helped her up onto the wagon seat with a courtesy that felt almost old-fashioned against the rough frontier setting. As they pulled away from Miller's General Store, Evelyn didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the mountains rising purple and magnificent in the distance, on the unfamiliar landscape that was now her home, whether she'd planned it that way or not. Behind them, Red Willow buzzed with fresh gossip. The mail-order bride had been rejected and rescued in the same afternoon. The story would spread, would grow, would follow her like a shadow. But Evelyn Hart had survived worse than shadows. And as the wagon rolled north toward the Triple R Ranch, toward a future she'd never imagined just hours before, she felt something unexpected uncurling in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Not yet, but possibility. The road to the Triple R stretched north through terrain that seemed to shift with every mile. From the dusty flats surrounding Red Willow to rolling grassland dotted with scrub oak, then gradually climbing into foothills where pine trees cast long shadows across the wagon track. Evelyn sat rigid on the wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her and the impossible situation she'd just agreed to. Caleb drove with easy competence, his attention mostly on the horses but occasionally flickering to the landscape as if reading signs Evelyn couldn't see. He'd been silent since they left town, giving her space to process what had just happened, but the quiet was beginning to feel heavier than conversation. "How far is your ranch?" Evelyn finally asked, needing to break the silence with something practical. "About 8 miles from town, another hour at this pace." Caleb glanced at her briefly. "We could push harder, but there's no rush. Better to arrive before dark with the horses fresh than save 20 minutes and wear them out. It was a rancher's logic, practical, patient, thinking ahead to tomorrow's work instead of just today's convenience. Evelyn found it oddly comforting after 6 months of Thomas Garrett's flowery letters that had promised everything and delivered nothing. "Tell me about your household," she said, falling into the role she'd accepted, even though her heart was still racing from the speed of the decision. "How many ranch hands live on the property? What are their names? Any particular habits or preferences I should know about?" Caleb's mouth quirked slightly, as if surprised by her immediate professionalism. "Right now I've got 4 full-time hands. Jack Moreno is my foreman, been with me since I started the ranch, knows cattle and horses better than most men know their own wives. He's quiet, keeps to himself, but he's fair, and the other men respect him. Then there's Pete Donovan, no relation to the stage driver, different Pete entirely. He's young, maybe 22, still learning but eager to prove himself. Tommy Chen came up from California 2 years ago, best hand with a rope I've ever seen. An old Dutch Harmon, who's been working cattle since before I was born, and never lets anyone forget it." "Dutch Harmon," Evelyn repeated, committing the names to memory. "Is that his given name or a nickname?" "Nickname. His real name is Heinrich, but he's been Dutch for so long I'm not sure he'd answer to anything else." Caleb navigated the wagon around a rocky section of road with practiced ease. "He's got strong opinions about everything from weather to politics to how eggs should be cooked. Don't let him rattle you. His bark is worse than his bite." "And the others? Any particular preferences for meals or schedules I should know about?" "Jack doesn't eat pork. Says it doesn't agree with him. Tommy's got a sweet tooth, always hoping for pie or cake if there's time to make it. Pete will eat anything put in front of him and ask for seconds. Dutch complains about everything but cleans his plate regardless." Caleb paused, then added, "They're good men, Miss Hart. Rough around the edges, not always mindful of their language or manners, but they work hard and they're loyal. They'll test you at first. New housekeeper always gets tested, but if you stand your ground and feed them well, they'll come around." Evelyn absorbed this information, trying to picture these men she'd be cooking for, cleaning up after, sharing a property with. It was so far removed from her life in Boston that it felt almost surreal, like she'd stepped into one of the dime novels her aunt had forbidden her to read. "What happened to your previous housekeeper?" The question was direct, perhaps too direct, but Evelyn needed to know what she was walking into. "I've had 3 in the past 2 years, Caleb admitted. First was Mrs. Henderson, widow from town who needed work. She lasted 4 months before her daughter in Denver sent for her to come help with a new grandbaby. Second was a young woman named Martha, who decided ranch life wasn't for her after 6 weeks, said it was too isolated, too much work, too far from civilization. Third was Clara Schmidt, who did well enough until her intended showed up from back east and they got married. That was 3 months ago. Since then, it's been Jack trying to manage meals, which mostly means beans and bacon and burned coffee." "So they're probably desperate for decent food," Evelyn said, understanding the practical advantage this gave her. "That works in my favor." "It does," Caleb agreed, "though I won't lie to you, it's hard work. 3 meals a day for 5 to 7 people depending on season, laundry for working men, keeping a house clean when dust blows in through every crack. My wife used to say ranching was hard on everyone, but housekeeping for ranchers was its own special kind of exhausting." The mention of his wife created a moment of awkward silence. Evelyn glanced at him, saw the tightness around his eyes that suggested the loss was still tender despite 3 years passing. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said quietly. "Sarah, you said her name was?" "Sarah." Caleb's voice gentled around the name. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said the West needed more women who weren't afraid to start over, who understood that building something new meant leaving old expectations behind." "Is that what I'm doing?" Evelyn heard the uncertainty in her own voice. "Starting over, or just surviving until I can afford to run away?" "I don't know," Caleb answered honestly. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. But Sarah used to say the best thing about the frontier was that it let you decide who you wanted to be, instead of having everyone else decide for you. Maybe that'll turn out true for you too." The conversation lapsed again, but this time the silence felt more companionable. Evelyn watched the landscape change as they climbed higher into the foothills. Wildflowers dotted the grassland, purple lupine, yellow arrowleaf balsam root, white clusters of yarrow. The air smelled different here than in Boston, drier, tinged with sage and pine, and something else she couldn't quite name. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. They crested a rise and Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said, pointing down into a valley that opened before them. "That's the Triple R." Evelyn followed his gesture and felt her breath catch. The ranch spread across the valley floor, a main house built of logs and stone, weathered but solid-looking, with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Behind it stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, corrals containing horses that lifted their heads to watch the approaching wagon. Beyond the immediate buildings, grassland rolled away toward distant mountains, and she could see dark shapes that must be cattle scattered across the range. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the manicured gardens and cobblestone streets of Boston. This was raw beauty, functional beauty, the kind that came from land being used for its intended purpose instead of decorated for show. "It's bigger than I expected," Evelyn admitted. 1,500 acres, Caleb said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. "Built it from nothing over the past 8 years. Started with 50 head of cattle and a claim on this valley. Now I'm running close to 300 head, breeding some of the best horses in the territory. It's good land, Miss Hart. Hard land, but good." As they descended into the valley, Evelyn could see more details. The house needed paint, the porch had a few loose boards, and laundry hung haphazardly on a line stretched between two posts, clearly the work of men unused to domestic tasks. But the barn looked well maintained. The fences were straight and sturdy, and the animals in the corrals appeared healthy and well cared for. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall, lean, with dark hair, and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He stopped when he saw the wagon, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex when he noticed Evelyn. "That's Jack," Caleb said quietly. "Let me handle the introductions." He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and jumped down, then came around to help Evelyn descend. She was grateful for the assistance. Her legs were stiff from the journey, and her traveling dress had gotten tangled around her ankles. Jack approached slowly, his eyes moving between Caleb and Evelyn with obvious questions. "Jack, this is Miss Evelyn Hart," Caleb said firmly. "She's going to be our new housekeeper. Miss Hart, this is Jack Moreno, my foreman." "Ma'am." Jack touched his hat brim politely, but his expression remained cautious. "Wasn't expecting you to bring someone back from town today." "Neither was I," Caleb admitted. "But circumstances arose and Miss Hart needed a position. I needed a housekeeper. Seemed like Providence." Jack's eyes flickered with something that might have been skepticism, but he kept his voice neutral. "The house isn't exactly ready for company. We've been batching it since Clara left." "I'm not company," Evelyn said, finding her voice. "I'm an employee, and I've seen what bachelor housekeeping looks like. I don't expect perfection." A slight smile tugged at Jack's mouth. "Good thing, ma'am. You won't find perfection anywhere on this property, except maybe in the horse barn, and that's only because Tommy's particular about his animals." "Where are the others?" Caleb asked, starting to unload Evelyn's trunk from the wagon. "Pete's checking the north fence line, should be back before supper. Tommy's working with that new mare in the far corral. Dutch rode out to check on the cattle in the high pasture, said he'd be back by dark." Jack moved to help with the trunk, his movements economical and practiced. "We weren't expecting to feed anyone fancy tonight. I was planning on beans and cornbread." "Miss Hart will take over meals starting tomorrow," Caleb said. "Tonight we'll make do with whatever's available. Right now, let's get her settled in the house." The interior of the main house was about what Evelyn expected from 3 months of bachelor housekeeping. Functional but chaotic. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. A large table dominated the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The kitchen area along one wall held a massive iron stove, open shelves stocked with dishes and provisions, and a dry sink with a pump handle. Dirty dishes were stacked haphazardly, dust coated every surface, and the floor looked like it hadn't seen a broom in weeks. But the bones of the house were good. The walls were solid, chinked tight against weather. Large windows let in generous light. The stove was high quality, well maintained despite the general disorder. With work, this could be a comfortable home. "Your room is back here," Caleb said, leading her through a doorway into a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a small bedroom, simply furnished with a bed, dresser, washstand, and a single chair. The room was clean, or at least cleaner than the main house, as if someone had made an effort to prepare it. "I had Jack air it out this morning," Caleb said, answering her unspoken question. "Put fresh linens on the bed. It's not fancy, but it's private and it's yours." Evelyn stepped into the room and felt something loosen in her chest. It was sparse, certainly, nothing like her room in her aunt's Boston house with its wallpaper and cushioned window seat. But it was hers. Her space, her refuge, bought with her agreement to work rather than bestowed as charity. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Jack and Caleb brought in her trunk, positioning it at the foot of the bed. After they left, closing the door behind them to give her privacy, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened in the past 6 hours. This morning felt like a lifetime ago. She'd been on a stage approaching Red Willow with her heart full of nervous hope. She'd been imagining her first meeting with Thomas, wondering if the reality would match the warmth of his letters. She'd been planning how to be the wife he needed, the partner he'd described wanting. Now she was sitting in a strange room in a ranch house 8 miles from town, preparing to cook for men she'd never met, committed to a future she'd never imagined. Evelyn pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she needed to prove herself capable starting tomorrow morning. Not when the alternative to this strange new life was destitution in a town that had already marked her as a scandal. A knock on her door pulled her from the spiral of her thoughts. "Miss Hart?" Caleb's voice came through the wood. "I'm heading out to check on some things before supper. Take your time getting settled. There's water in the kitchen if you want to wash up, and I'll make sure one of the men brings in fresh water for your room. Supper will be simple tonight, just whatever Jack can throw together. Tomorrow you can take stock of supplies and let me know what you need." "Thank you," Evelyn called back, grateful he wasn't expecting her to start work immediately. "I'll be out shortly." She heard his footsteps retreat, then silence. Slowly, Evelyn stood and opened her trunk. The wedding dress was on top, carefully folded in tissue paper to protect the delicate lace she'd spent so many evenings stitching. She lifted it out, felt the weight of it in her hands, remembered the hope she'd sewn into every seam. For a moment, she considered unpacking it, hanging it in the small wardrobe. But what would be the point? She wasn't getting married. Thomas Garrett had made that abundantly clear when he chose a hotel owner's daughter over a mail-order bride with nothing but education and determination. Evelyn refolded the dress and placed it back in the trunk, burying it beneath her everyday clothes. Maybe someday she'd be able to look at it without feeling the sting of humiliation. But that day wasn't today. Instead, she unpacked her practical dresses, the dark wool for work, the navy traveling dress she'd already ruined with red Colorado dust, a simple cotton day dress in gray. She hung them in the wardrobe, arranged her few personal items on the dresser, and positioned her mother's silver brush where she could see it from the bed. Small gestures of domesticity, claiming this space as her own. When she emerged from her room 20 minutes later, she found the main house empty except for a young man she didn't recognize working at the stove. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, his face breaking into a friendly smile. "You must be Miss Hart," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'm Pete Donovan. Caleb said you'd be joining us." "Mr. Donovan?" Evelyn nodded politely. "Please don't let me interrupt your work." "Interrupt away," Pete said cheerfully. "I'm terrible at this, and I know it. Just trying to heat up the beans Jack made yesterday and not burn the cornbread." "You like cornbread, Miss Hart? Because I'm not sure this batch is going to be edible." Despite everything, Evelyn felt a smile tug at her lips. Pete couldn't be more than 22, with an open, earnest face and the kind of natural friendliness that probably made him popular everywhere he went. "May I?" She gestured toward the stove. "Please." Pete stepped aside gratefully. "Save us all from my cooking." Evelyn moved to the stove and assessed the situation. The beans were heating unevenly, already starting to scorch on the bottom. The cornbread batter in the pan looked wrong. Too thick, not enough liquid. She could fix this, or at least prevent complete disaster. "Do you have milk?" she asked. "And another egg if there are any?" "I'll check." Pete rummaged in a cupboard and produced a pitcher of milk and 3 eggs. "Will these work?" "Perfect." Evelyn cracked an egg into the cornbread batter, added milk, and stirred until the consistency improved. Then she adjusted the heat under the beans, stirring them thoroughly to prevent further burning. It wasn't gourmet cooking, but it would be edible. "You're a miracle worker," Pete said, watching her efficient movements. "We've been eating Jack's cooking for 3 months. Don't get me wrong, he's a genius with cattle and horses. But with food? Let's just say we've all lost weight." "I heard that." Jack's voice came from the doorway where he'd appeared silently. "And it's true, so I'm not going to argue. Miss Hart, you need anything else for tonight?" "Not for tonight," Evelyn said, sliding the cornbread into the oven. "But tomorrow I'll need to do a complete inventory of your supplies. And someone will need to show me where everything is. The root cellar, the spring house, if you have one, wherever you store staples." "I can do that tomorrow morning," Jack offered. "I'll be around the ranch anyway." The door opened again and another man entered. Asian features, slight build, moving with the grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. He stopped when he saw Evelyn, surprise flickering across his face. "Tommy Chen," Jack made the introduction. "Tommy, this is Miss Hart. She's our new housekeeper." "Ma'am." Tommy's bow was slight but respectful. "Welcome to the Triple R." "Thank you, Mr. Chen." "Just Tommy, please. We don't stand much on formality out here." He glanced at the stove where Evelyn was monitoring the cornbread. "Something smells better than usual. That you're doing?" "Just fixing what Mr. Donovan started," Evelyn said diplomatically. "Don't be modest," Pete called from where he was now setting the table. "She saved us from charcoal and raw batter." The door banged open once more and an older man stomped in, his face weathered like old leather, his white hair sticking up in tufts where he'd clearly been wearing a hat all day. He stopped short when he saw Evelyn, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "What's this?" he demanded, looking around at the other men. "Nobody told me we were entertaining guests." "Not a guest, Dutch," Caleb said, entering behind the older man. "This is Miss Evelyn Hart, our new housekeeper. Miss Hart, this is Dutch Harmon." Dutch's eyes narrowed as he studied Evelyn from head to toe. "Housekeeper, city clothes, fancy speech, hands that haven't seen a day's hard work. How long you planning to last, Miss Boston? Week? 2 weeks before you run back east crying about how hard ranch life is?" The room went silent. Pete looked mortified. Jack's expression turned carefully neutral, and Tommy suddenly found the floor fascinating. Caleb opened his mouth to intervene, but Evelyn spoke first. "I'm from Boston, yes," she said evenly, meeting Dutch's challenging gaze without flinching. "My hands haven't worked on a ranch, that's true. But they've worked, teaching music, managing a household, sewing clothes, doing laundry, cooking meals. I may not know ranching, Mr. Harmon, but I know work. And I know that men who spend all day judging people instead of doing their jobs usually aren't worth the wages they're paid." Dutch's eyebrows shot up. Then, unexpectedly, he barked out a laugh. "She's got spine. I'll give her that." He moved to the table and dropped into a chair. "All right, Miss Boston, let's see if you can back up that sass with decent cornbread. Last 3 housekeepers couldn't manage even that." "Then your expectations should be appropriately low," Evelyn said crisply, turning back to the stove to check on the bread. Behind her, she heard Pete suppress a snort of laughter and Jack's quiet murmur of, "This might actually work." Supper that night was simple but edible. The salvaged beans and cornbread, plus some bacon Pete fried up to supplement. The men ate with the focus of people who'd been doing physical labor all day, and Evelyn found herself studying them as she took her own place at the table. Jack ate methodically, efficiently, without wasted motion. Everything about him suggested a man who thought before he acted. Pete was enthusiastic about everything, complimenting the cornbread 3 times and asking if there might be pie tomorrow. Tommy ate quietly, watchful, saying little but missing nothing. And Dutch alternated between eating and offering commentary on everything from the beans, too much salt, to the weather, going to rain by Thursday, to politics. That fool governor doesn't know cattle from carrots. Caleb presided over the table with quiet authority, occasionally steering conversation away from topics that might be inappropriate with Evelyn present, making sure she was included when the men discussed the next day's work. "We've got fence repairs in the north pasture," Jack was saying, "and Tommy and I can handle that. Pete, you're going to help Dutch move those cattle from the high meadow. They're eating it down too far." "What about the supplies run?" Caleb asked. We're low on several things. I can make a list tonight, Evelyn offered. If someone's going to town tomorrow, I'll need staples: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and some fresh vegetables if any are available. I'll go day after tomorrow, Caleb said. Give you time to do that inventory and figure out what you need. Anything urgent can wait until then. Will you be bringing her back to town anytime soon? Dutch asked bluntly. So she can find that mail-order groom who jilted her? The table went silent again. Evelyn felt heat rising to her face, but she kept her voice steady. Thomas Garrett married someone else, Mr. Harmon. I'm not looking for him or for any other groom. I'm here to work. Heard about that in town, Dutch continued, apparently immune to social signals. Garrett strung you along for months, then married the hotel owner's daughter for her dowry. That's a hell of a thing to do to a woman. Dutch, Caleb's voice carried warning. That's enough. Just saying what everyone's thinking, Dutch muttered. Girl travels all this way, gets left high and dry. Now she's working for you. Town's gonna talk. Let them talk, Evelyn said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. I can't control what happened to me, but I can control what I do about it. I chose to take this position because it gives me options I wouldn't have otherwise. If the town wants to gossip about that, it says more about them than it does about me. Dutch studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just wanted to see if you were the type to crumble or the type to fight. Looks like you're the fighting type. I suppose I am, Evelyn agreed. I wasn't sure until today, but apparently I am. After supper, the men dispersed to various evening tasks. Jack to check on the horses one more time, Tommy to oil some tack that needed attention, Pete to practice his roping by lamplight, Dutch to his bunk claiming his back hurt and he needed to lie down. Caleb helped Evelyn clear the table, despite her protests that she could handle it. You don't need to do this, she said as he carried plates to the dry sink. I'm the housekeeper. This is my job. Tonight you're settling in, Caleb corrected. Tomorrow the job starts in earnest. Tonight we share the work. They washed dishes in companionable silence, the lamplight casting long shadows across the kitchen. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and through the windows Evelyn could see more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, the sky thick with them, the Milky Way a bright river of light. It's beautiful, she said softly, drawn to the window. I've never seen so many stars. Well, one of the things Sarah loved most about the ranch, Caleb said, his voice quiet with memory. She used to say the night sky out here made all the hardship worthwhile. Evelyn turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her from destitution, who'd offered employment instead of charity, who spoke of his dead wife with such tender grief. Thank you, she said, for today, for all of it. I know I thanked you earlier, but I'm not sure you understand how much it meant. You would have figured something out, Caleb said. You're resourceful, but I'm glad I could offer an option that gives you time to make your own decisions about what comes next. What if I'm terrible at this? The question emerged before Evelyn could stop it. What if I can't manage cooking for 6 men, or the laundry proves too much, or... Then you'll learn, Caleb interrupted gently. Same as everyone else who's ever taken on something new. You think I knew how to run a ranch when I started? I made 100 mistakes that first year, lost cattle, broke equipment, nearly killed myself trying to break a horse that was too green. But I learned. You will too. His confidence in her felt like a gift, unearned but precious. Evelyn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Get some rest, Caleb said. Tomorrow starts early. We're usually up by 5, breakfast by 6. But take your time finding your rhythm. The men will survive cold biscuits and burnt coffee for a few days while you sort things out. Evelyn retreated to her room as the men settled in for the night, some in the bunkhouse, Caleb in what she assumed was his own bedroom at the other end of the house. She changed into her nightgown, brushed out her hair with her mother's silver brush, and climbed into bed. The mattress was firmer than what she was used to, the pillow flatter, the quilt handmade from scraps rather than store-bought. But it was clean and it was comfortable, and most importantly, it was hers, earned by her agreement to work, not granted as charity or obligation. Evelyn lay in the darkness, listening to unfamiliar sounds, horses shifting in the barn, the wind moving through pine trees, an owl calling from somewhere nearby. So different from Boston's nighttime symphony of carriage wheels and street vendors, and neighbors' conversations through thin walls. She thought about Thomas Garrett in Denver with his new bride, probably congratulating himself on a wise decision, a hotel and land instead of a penniless music teacher with nothing to offer but education and determination. She thought about her aunt in Boston, probably feeling vindicated that Evelyn's foolish Western adventure had ended in failure. But it hadn't ended in failure. Not really. It had ended in something Evelyn had never had before, true independence. Not the conditional kindness of relatives or the promised partnership of a husband, but her own work, her own wages, her own choices about what came next. Tomorrow she would start earning that independence. She would cook breakfast for 6 men, take inventory of an unfamiliar household, learn the rhythms of ranch life. She would prove to Dutch that she wasn't going to run back east crying. She would prove to herself that she could build a life from nothing but determination and unwillingness to quit. Evelyn closed her eyes and let sleep take her, carried away on the wings of exhaustion and something that felt startlingly like hope. The rooster's crow pulled Evelyn from sleep before dawn had fully broken. She lay disoriented for a moment in the unfamiliar darkness, her mind struggling to place where she was. Then memory flooded back. Red Willow, Thomas Garrett's rejection, Caleb Reed's offer, the ranch house bedroom that was now hers by virtue of employment rather than marriage. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, choosing her darkest work dress and pinning her hair into a severe bun that would stay out of her way during kitchen work. Through her small window, she could see lamplight already burning in the barn. The men were up, beginning their day, and she needed to have breakfast ready when they came in from morning chores. The kitchen was empty when she entered, but someone had already stoked the stove and set coffee to boil. Evelyn stood for a moment, surveying her new domain. Yesterday's dishes were clean and stacked, Caleb's doing, she suspected, but everything else spoke of months of bachelor housekeeping. Flour dusted the counter, the floor needed sweeping, and grease coated the area around the stove. But first, breakfast. Evelyn found eggs in the spring house Pete had shown her last night, bacon in the cold cellar, flour and baking powder in the pantry. She'd start simple: biscuits, scrambled eggs, bacon, and the coffee that was already brewing. Nothing fancy, but substantial enough for men facing a full day of physical labor. She was pulling the second pan of biscuits from the oven when the kitchen door opened and Jack entered, followed by Tommy and Pete. All 3 men stopped short when they saw the table set with plates of food, steam rising from fresh biscuits, the smell of bacon filling the air. "Morning, Miss Hart," Jack said, removing his hat. "You didn't have to get up this early your first day." "When else would I cook breakfast?" Evelyn replied practically. "Sit down before it gets cold." They obeyed, settling around the table with the careful movements of men unsure of the new social dynamics. Caleb entered a moment later, taking in the scene with obvious satisfaction. "Smells better than anything we've had in months," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Dutch still getting dressed?" "Said his back was acting up," Pete reported. "He'll be along." As if summoned, Dutch shuffled in, moving stiffly but with determination. He stopped when he saw the spread on the table, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Well now," he said gruffly, "maybe Miss Boston knows her way around a kitchen after all." "Don't sound so surprised, Mr. Harmon," Evelyn said, pouring coffee. "I did mention I knew how to work." The men ate with focused appreciation, and Evelyn found herself gratified by their response. These weren't Boston dinner guests offering polite compliments while barely touching their food. These were working men fueling themselves for demanding labor, and their clean plates spoke louder than any words could. "These biscuits," Pete said around a mouthful, "are the best thing I've eaten since my mama's cooking back in Kansas." "Don't talk with your mouth full," Dutch said automatically, then reached for his third biscuit. "But the boy's not wrong. These are good." After breakfast, while the men headed out to start their workday, Evelyn began the inventory she'd promised. The pantry revealed a haphazard collection of supplies, flour and cornmeal in abundance, but low on sugar and salt. Coffee beans in quantity, but almost no tea. Dried beans of every variety, but no dried fruit or preserves. It was the inventory of men who bought what they knew they needed and ignored everything else. She was making notes when Jack returned, as promised, to show her around the property's storage areas. "Root cellars this way," he said, leading her to a dugout structure behind the main house. Stays cool year-round. We keep potatoes, onions, carrots when we have them. Used to have more variety when Sarah was alive. She kept a garden. The mention of Caleb's wife was casual, without the weighted grief Caleb carried. Evelyn followed Jack down wooden steps into the cool darkness, waiting while he lit a lantern. The root cellar was half empty, containing only basics: potatoes, onions, a few wrinkled apples from last fall's harvest. Against one wall stood empty shelves that had probably once held preserved vegetables and fruits. "Does anyone maintain a garden now?" Evelyn asked. "Not really. We plant a few things each spring, but nobody tends them properly. By July, everything's either eaten by rabbits or dried up from lack of water." Jack's tone suggested this was a source of frustration. Sarah used to have tomatoes, beans, squash, all sorts of things, made a real difference in what we ate. Evelyn made mental notes. A garden would be additional work, certainly, but it would also provide variety and reduce grocery costs, something to consider once she had the household running smoothly. Jack showed her the smokehouse next, currently empty but functional, and the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched in the dirt. "Tommy takes care of the chickens mostly," Jack explained. "Collects eggs, feeds them, keeps the coop clean. But if you want to take that over, he won't complain." "I can manage the eggs at least," Evelyn said. "Add them to my morning routine." They walked back toward the house, and Evelyn found herself studying the ranch with new eyes. Yesterday, it had been a foreign landscape, overwhelming in its unfamiliarity. Today, it was beginning to feel like a puzzle she could solve, a system she could learn to manage. "Can I ask you something, Jack?" She stopped near the porch steps. "Why did Caleb really hire me? The truth, not the polite version." Jack was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "You know about Sarah," he finally said, "about how she came west. Caleb never got over the guilt of not finding her sooner, not being able to save her from those years of being treated like a servant in someone else's home. When she got sick, consumption, the doctor said, she made him promise something." "What did she promise?" Evelyn asked softly. "That if he ever had the chance to help a woman in the same situation, he'd do it. That he'd make sure no one else went through what she did, being stranded and vulnerable with nowhere to turn." Jack met her eyes directly. "So when he saw you in that store yesterday, being humiliated and rejected, he saw Sarah, and he did what he'd promised her he'd do." The honesty of the answer settled something in Evelyn's chest. "So I'm his penance." "You're his promise kept," Jack corrected gently. "There's a difference. He's not trying to save you because he feels guilty. He's trying to give you choices because Sarah never had any." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding Caleb better now. "Thank you for telling me. Just thought you should know what you're walking into," Jack said. "Caleb's a good man, best rancher in the territory, fair employer. But he's still grieving Sarah. Probably will be for years yet. Don't expect more from him than what he's offering." "I'm not," Evelyn assured him. "I'm here to work. Nothing more." "Good." Jack touched his hat brim. "Then I think you'll do just fine, Miss Hart. Better than fine if this morning's breakfast is any indication." The rest of the day passed in a blur of work. Evelyn scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, swept and mopped floors, organized the pantry into some semblance of order. She made a list of supplies needed for the town trip: flour, sugar, salt, yeast, dried fruit, molasses, tea, and a dozen other items the bachelor household had been managing without. Lunch was simple. Sandwiches from leftover bacon and bread she'd baked that morning, but the men ate gratefully and without complaint. Supper was more ambitious: pot roast with potatoes and carrots, biscuits again because they'd been so well received at breakfast, and an apple pie made from the wrinkled apples in the root cellar. When she set the pie on the table, still warm from the oven, Dutch actually smiled. "Haven't had pie in 3 years," he said, his gruff voice softening. "Not since Sarah died." The men ate in reverent silence, and when Pete asked hopefully if there might be pie again sometime soon, Evelyn found herself promising to bake regularly if Tommy could get fresh eggs from the chickens. "I'll get you eggs," Tommy said immediately. "As many as you want. Those hens can lay more than we've been collecting." After supper, while the men relaxed on the porch in the cool evening air, Evelyn tackled the pile of mending she'd discovered in a basket in the corner. Shirts with missing buttons, pants with torn seams, socks that needed darning. She sat in the lamplight with her mother's sewing kit, methodically working through the pile while listening to the murmur of conversation from outside. She was halfway through darning Dutch's socks when Caleb came back inside, carrying the list she'd made that morning. "This is quite a list," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "You planning to feed an army?" "I'm planning to feed 6 working men properly," Evelyn corrected. "That means more than just beans and bacon. Vegetables, fruit, variety. Men work better when they're well fed." "No argument there." Caleb scanned the list again. "Some of this is going to raise eyebrows in town. Dried fruit, molasses, tea. People will wonder what I need with fancy supplies." "Let them wonder," Evelyn said, her needle moving steadily through the worn wool. "Unless you'd prefer I stick to beans and bacon?" "I would not," Caleb said firmly. "Order whatever you need. The men's health and morale are worth more than avoiding gossip." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scratch of Caleb's pencil as he added notes to the supply list and the soft whisper of Evelyn's thread through fabric. "You're doing well," Caleb said quietly. "Better than I expected, honestly. Most women would still be overwhelmed on their second day." Most women didn't have my training," Evelyn replied. "My mother believed in preparing her daughter for practical life, not just decorative accomplishments. And my aunt, for all her faults, ran an efficient household. I learned from watching her. Still, this is different from Boston. Everything is different from Boston." Evelyn tied off her thread and reached for another sock. But different isn't necessarily worse. It's just different. The kitchen door opened and Jack entered, his expression troubled. "Boss, we've got a problem," he said without preamble. "Dutch just rode in from checking the north boundary. Says he found fresh tracks, at least 3 riders, maybe 4, moving along our fence line." Caleb was on his feet immediately. "When?" "Today, he thinks. Tracks were fresh, no rain to wash them out." Jack glanced at Evelyn, then back to Caleb. "Could be drifters, could be nothing. But after last month, we take it seriously," Caleb finished grimly. "Get the men. I want doubled patrols tonight, rotating shifts. Nobody rides alone until we know what we're dealing with." "What happened last month?" Evelyn asked, setting aside her mending. The 2 men exchanged glances, clearly debating how much to tell her. "We had some trouble with cattle thieves," Caleb finally said. "Lost about 20 head before we caught on and drove them off. They've been quiet since, but if they're scouting our property again..." "Then they might come back," Evelyn finished. "What should I do?" "Keep the house locked at night," Caleb said. "Keep the rifle by your door. It's loaded, but the safety's on. If you hear anything unusual, anything at all, you fire 1 shot in the air. We'll come running." "I don't know how to shoot a rifle," Evelyn admitted. "Then I'll teach you tomorrow," Caleb said. "Every woman on a ranch should know how to handle a gun. It's just practical." Jack had already left to gather the men, and Evelyn could hear urgent voices outside. Caleb moved to the gun cabinet in the corner, checking weapons with practiced efficiency. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking at her. "This wasn't part of what I promised you. Safe employment," I said. "But ranching comes with risks, and cattle thieves are one of them." "You didn't promise me safety," Evelyn corrected. "You promised me employment and honest wages. Those are different things." Caleb did look at her then, something like respect in his eyes. "Most women would be frightened." "I am frightened," Evelyn said honestly. "But I'm not helpless. Show me how to lock the doors properly, where the rifle goes, what signal to listen for. I'll manage." He showed her the locks, solid iron bars that dropped into place across both doors. The rifle went in a rack beside her bedroom door, close enough to grab quickly, but out of sight from the windows. The signal, if trouble came, would be 3 rapid gunshots from outside. "If you hear that," Caleb said seriously, "you bar the doors, take the rifle, and position yourself where you can see both entrances. Don't open for anyone unless you hear my voice or Jack specifically saying all clear. Not Pete's voice, not Tommy's, not Dutch's, mine or Jack's, those exact words. Understood?" "Understood." Evelyn's mouth was dry, but her voice stayed steady. "Good." Caleb grabbed his hat and gun belt. "I'm sorry to leave you alone your second night here, but you have work to do," Evelyn finished. "Go. I'll be fine." After he left, Evelyn finished the mending with shaking hands, then prepared the kitchen for morning. She mixed biscuit dough and covered it to rise overnight, set out ingredients for breakfast, made sure the coffee pot was ready to boil. Routine tasks, familiar rhythms, small ways to convince herself she was fine. But when she retired to her room and barred the door behind her, when she positioned the rifle where Caleb had instructed and lay down in her nightgown with her heart pounding, Evelyn had to admit the truth. This was nothing like Boston, and whether that was better or worse remained to be seen. She didn't sleep well. Every sound outside brought her fully awake, horses moving, men calling to each other, the wind rattling the windows. Once she heard 3 shots and nearly grabbed the rifle before realizing they weren't rapid enough to be the danger signal. Just someone communicating across distance in the darkness. Dawn came as a relief. Evelyn dressed quickly and emerged from her room to find Caleb already in the kitchen, looking exhausted. "Anything happen?" she asked, lighting the stove. "Quiet night. Jack's still out with Tommy, doing a final sweep before breakfast." Caleb sank into a chair. "We found more tracks, though. Definitely 4 riders, definitely scouting our herd. They're planning something." "What will you do?" "Keep watching, set guards, make it clear we're ready for them." Caleb rubbed his face tiredly. "And hope they decide easier targets exist elsewhere." Evelyn made coffee strong and black, the way she'd learned the men preferred it. While it brewed, she started breakfast. Eggs, bacon, the biscuits from last night's dough. Normal tasks, everyday rhythms, life, continuing despite the threat lurking at the edges. The men trickled in over the next hour, all of them showing signs of a sleepless night. They ate quickly, efficiently, then scattered back to their posts. Only Dutch remained, claiming his back couldn't handle another night of riding, and he'd be more useful keeping watch from the barn. "Don't you worry, Miss Boston," he said as he headed out. "Those thieves won't get past us. We take care of what's ours." The possessive pronoun stuck with Evelyn as she cleaned up from breakfast. We. Ours. Somehow, in less than 2 full days, she'd been included in that collective ownership. She was part of what needed protecting now, part of the ranch's assets that demanded defense. It should have felt presumptuous. Instead, it felt oddly comforting. The day passed in tense normalcy. Evelyn cooked, cleaned, mended, and kept the house running while the men maintained their vigilance outside. She caught glimpses of them riding the fence lines, checking the herds, positioning themselves strategically around the property. They were preparing for battle, though whether battle would come remained uncertain. At lunch, Pete arrived with news. "Caleb wants to know if you can handle supper for 8 instead of 6. He's riding to the Wilson Ranch this afternoon, asking if they can spare 2 hands for a few days. Safety in numbers." "I can feed 8, Evelyn confirmed. "Or 10 if necessary. Tell him not to worry about the cooking." That evening, Caleb returned with 2 additional men, the Wilson brothers, both young and eager, both carrying rifles and looking ready for trouble. Evelyn served stew and cornbread, stretched the portions carefully, and listened to the men discuss strategy over their meal. "We'll rotate watches," Caleb was saying. 2 men on patrol at all times, positions changing every 4 hours. They won't be able to predict our movements or find gaps in coverage." "What about the stock in the far pasture?" Jack asked. "That's our most vulnerable point. We move them closer tomorrow, even if the grazing's not as good. I'd rather have the herd where we can watch them than lose cattle to thieves." The conversation continued, technical and tactical, and Evelyn focused on keeping coffee cups filled and making sure no one went hungry. This was her contribution, not riding patrol or standing guard, but making sure the men who did those things were fed and ready. After supper, Caleb found her in the kitchen washing dishes. "I need to teach you about the rifle," he said, "before it gets full dark. Just basic safety and operation. Can you spare 20 minutes? Evelyn dried her hands and followed him outside to an area behind the barn, away from the house and animals. He handed her the rifle, showing her how to hold it properly, where to place her hands, how to sight along the barrel. "It's going to kick when you fire," he warned. "Brace yourself against it. Don't fight it. And whatever you do, keep the barrel pointed away from anything you don't intend to shoot." "Even into the air for the warning shot?" "Especially then. Bullet comes down somewhere." Caleb positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance with impersonal efficiency. "Now, when you're ready, take a breath, let half of it out, and squeeze the trigger gently. Don't jerk it." Evelyn did as instructed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound loud enough to make her ears ring. The shot went wide of the target Caleb had set up, but not by much. "Good," he said. "Try again." They practiced until Evelyn could consistently hit near the target and operate the rifle's safety without fumbling. Her shoulder would be bruised tomorrow, and her hands were shaking from adrenaline, but she understood the weapon now. If she needed to use it, she could. "Thank you," she said as they walked back to the house in the gathering darkness. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb replied grimly. "Let's hope you never need to use what I just taught you." That night, lying in her barred room with the rifle beside her bed, Evelyn discovered she was too exhausted for fear. She fell asleep to the sound of horses and men moving in the darkness, standing guard against threats that might never materialize. But the threats did materialize 3 nights later. Evelyn woke to the sound she'd been dreading. 3 rapid gunshots splitting the night air. She was out of bed instantly, grabbing the rifle with hands that barely shook, positioning herself in the corner of the main room where she could see both doors. Outside, she heard shouting, more gunshots, the thunder of horses moving fast. Through the window, she caught glimpses of motion, riders silhouetted against moonlight, muzzle flashes from rifles, the chaos of confrontation. It seemed to last forever and be over in seconds simultaneously. Then silence, thick and terrible, broken only by the sound of her own harsh breathing. Minutes passed. Evelyn's arms ached from holding the rifle ready. Her heart pounded so hard she felt dizzy. But she held her position, remembering Caleb's instructions. Don't open until you hear the right signal. Finally, a voice from outside. "Miss Hart, it's Caleb. All clear. You can open the door." Evelyn's hand shook as she lowered the rifle and moved to the door. She lifted the bar, pulled it open, and found Caleb standing in the moonlight. He was covered in dust, his shirt torn, but he was standing. "Are you hurt?" she demanded immediately. "Bruised, nothing serious." He stepped inside and she saw Jack and Tommy behind him, both looking battered but intact. "We drove them off. They won't be back." "The others? Pete? Dutch? The Wilson brothers?" "All fine. Pete got knocked off his horse but landed in soft dirt. Dutch is madder than a wet hen that his back kept him out of the fight. The Wilsons are chasing the last of the thieves toward the county line." Caleb sank into a chair as if his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "It's over, Miss Hart. We're safe." Evelyn set the rifle aside with shaking hands and moved to the stove, lighting it with automatic precision. "You need coffee, and probably food. Sit down, all of you. Tell me who's hurt, and how badly." They obeyed. These men who'd just fought off armed thieves, following the orders of a woman who'd been on the ranch less than a week. Evelyn made coffee, heated up leftover stew, and examined each man for injuries that needed more than superficial attention. Jack had a gash on his arm that needed bandaging. Tommy's ribs were bruised where he'd been kicked by a spooked horse. Caleb had scraped his hands raw grabbing rope during the confrontation. Nothing life-threatening, but all of them would be sore for days. As she bandaged Jack's arm with steady hands, Evelyn realized something had shifted. She'd passed some invisible test tonight, not by fighting, but by staying calm, following instructions, and being ready with practical help when the danger passed. The men looked at her differently now, with a respect that had nothing to do with her cooking. "You did good tonight," Caleb said quietly as she wrapped his scraped palms. "Some women would have panicked." "I was terrified," Evelyn admitted. "But panic wouldn't have helped anyone." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't have. But courage in the face of fear, that helps everyone." The Wilson brothers returned an hour later with news that the thieves had scattered, heading for Denver and unlikely to risk returning to a ranch with such organized defense. The immediate danger was over, though vigilance would continue for weeks to ensure no one circled back. Finally, as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, the men dispersed to catch what sleep they could before the regular workday began. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, exhausted and shaking now that the crisis had passed, and looked around at the evidence of the night, bloody bandages in the basin, empty coffee cups scattered across the table, rifles stacked by the door. This was her life now. Not the refined parlors of Boston or the carefully managed household of her aunt. This was raw, dangerous, unpredictable frontier life where violence could erupt without warning and survival depended on courage and competence in equal measure. Evelyn cleaned the kitchen with methodical precision, made fresh coffee, and started preparing breakfast for men who would need substantial fuel after a sleepless night of battle. And as she worked, she realized something profound. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the work, not of the isolation, not even of the danger. She was becoming what this place demanded: strong, capable, unshakable in crisis. Thomas Garrett had rejected her because she brought nothing but education and determination. But here, on the Triple R Ranch, those qualities were proving to be exactly enough. The weeks that followed the night of the cattle thieves settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, though Evelyn knew better than to take any day for granted now. She rose before dawn, started coffee, prepared breakfast for men whose respect she'd earned through steady competence rather than dramatic heroics. The bruises on her shoulder from rifle practice faded, but she continued the lessons with Caleb twice a week, becoming proficient enough that Dutch stopped calling her Miss Boston and started calling her the housekeeper who can shoot. Summer deepened across the Colorado mountains, bringing heat that shimmered across the grasslands and thunderstorms that rolled through the valleys with biblical intensity. Evelyn learned to read the weather the way the men did, watching cloud formations, feeling shifts in wind direction, noting how the horses behaved when pressure systems changed. She learned which herbs grew wild near the creek and could be used for cooking, how to preserve vegetables in the root cellar, how to make soap from lye and fat rendered from butchered cattle. The garden she'd planted in late May was thriving now, tended in early mornings before the heat became oppressive. Tomatoes ripened on the vine. Green beans climbed strings she'd strung between posts. Squash sprawled across carefully tilled earth. The men teased her about her devotion to the garden, but they ate the fresh vegetables gratefully, and Pete had been caught more than once stealing tomatoes straight from the vine. "It's not stealing if you grew it," he'd protested when Evelyn confronted him. "It's stealing if you eat it before I can put it in the supper pot," she'd replied, but without real anger. The garden had become a source of quiet pride, proof that she could make things grow in this harsh climate, that she could contribute something beyond basic housekeeping. On a Thursday morning in late July, Caleb announced he needed to make a trip to Red Willow for supplies and to conduct some business at the bank. Evelyn handed him her usual list: flour, sugar, coffee, and a request for fabric if the general store had anything serviceable. Her work dresses were showing wear from constant use, and her Boston clothes were completely impractical for ranch life. "I could use some help carrying supplies," Caleb said, folding the list carefully. "Would you want to come along, see how the town's changed since you arrived?" Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse. She hadn't been back to Red Willow since that humiliating afternoon in Miller's general store, and she had no desire to face the gossip and judgment that surely awaited her. But she also recognized the practical advantage of selecting her own fabric and supplies, and hiding from town forever wasn't sustainable. "All right," she agreed. "Give me 20 minutes to change and make sure the men have enough lunch to manage without me." She dressed in her least-worn day dress, pinned her hair carefully, and tried not to feel like she was preparing for battle. But that's exactly what returning to Red Willow felt like. Walking back into territory where she'd been publicly rejected and humiliated, now armed with nothing but 3 months of honest work and the quiet knowledge that she'd survived what should have broken her. The ride into town was pleasant enough. Caleb kept up easy conversation about ranch matters, the need to repair the barn roof before winter, plans to purchase additional breeding stock in the fall, his satisfaction with how the cattle were fattening on summer grass. He didn't mention Thomas Garrett or acknowledge the awkwardness of Evelyn's return to town, for which she was grateful. But when they rolled down Red Willow's main street, she felt every eye turned toward the wagon. Women paused in their shopping, men stopped their conversations, children were hushed mid-shout. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected in Miller's general store was returning with the rancher who'd taken her home that same afternoon. The gossip practically wrote itself. "Ignore them," Caleb said quietly. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." "I know that," Evelyn replied, lifting her chin. "Doesn't make it comfortable, though." They stopped first at the bank, where Caleb needed to handle some financial matters. Evelyn waited in the wagon, aware of the watching faces, the whispered conversations. A woman she didn't recognize approached with obvious curiosity. "You're Caleb Reed's housekeeper, aren't you?" The woman's tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp with judgment. "I am," Evelyn confirmed. Must be quite an arrangement, the woman continued. Living out there alone with all those men. People do talk. I imagine they do, Evelyn said evenly. People seem to have a lot of time for talking in this town. The woman's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Patterson, I do hope you're not bothering Miss Hart with unnecessary conversation. Evelyn turned to find an older woman approaching, perhaps 60, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. Mrs. Patterson retreated immediately, muttering something about needing to check on her children. Don't mind Alice Patterson, the older woman said, stopping beside the wagon. She's got more opinions than sense, and shares them both liberally. I'm Margaret Wilson. My sons helped with your cattle thief problem last month. Mrs. Wilson. Evelyn recognized the name immediately. Your sons were very brave. Please thank them again for their help. They were glad to do it. Neighbors help neighbors out here when they're worth helping. Margaret's sharp eyes studied Evelyn with assessment rather than judgment. My boys tell me you kept your head during the trouble, had coffee and bandages ready when it was over. That shows character. It shows basic competence, Evelyn corrected. Anyone could have done the same. But most wouldn't have, Margaret replied. Most would have panicked or fainted or made themselves the center of attention when the men needed to focus on real problems. You did what needed doing and didn't make a fuss about it. That's rare. Evelyn wasn't sure how to respond to such direct praise. Before she could formulate an answer, Caleb emerged from the bank and tipped his hat to Margaret. Mrs. Wilson, good to see you. Caleb, I was just telling Miss Hart that my sons speak highly of her composure during your recent difficulties. Margaret's tone made it clear she expected no argument. I've invited her to the ladies' church social next week. We could use someone with actual education at our meetings. Too many of us are repeating the same tired opinions to each other. That's very kind, Evelyn began, but I'm not sure... Not sure you'd be welcome? Margaret interrupted. Well, you are. I'm welcoming you. And what I say carries weight in this town, Miss Hart. If you want to be part of this community instead of just living adjacent to it, you'll come to the social. It was phrased as an invitation, but felt like a command. Evelyn glanced at Caleb, who looked as surprised as she felt. I'll think about it, Evelyn finally said. You do that. Social is Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, at the church. Bring one of those pies my sons won't stop talking about. Margaret nodded to both of them and walked away with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. Well, Caleb said, climbing back onto the wagon, that was unexpected. Does she really have that much influence? Evelyn asked. Margaret Wilson? She owns half the county, sits on every charitable board, and her late husband was the territorial judge. When Margaret speaks, people listen. Caleb guided the wagon toward Miller's General Store. If she's decided you're worth defending, you've got powerful protection in this town. Miller's General Store felt different than Evelyn remembered. Or perhaps she felt different, steadier, less vulnerable, carrying 3 months of survival like armor. Miller himself was behind the counter, and his expression when he saw her was complex, surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been grudging respect. Miss Hart, he said carefully, didn't expect to see you back in town. I live 8 miles away, Mr. Miller, Evelyn replied coolly. Where else would I shop? She handed him her list and began examining the fabric selection while he gathered supplies. The calicos were rough but serviceable, and she selected enough dark blue material for 2 work dresses. Practical, durable, appropriate for ranch life. Heard you handled yourself well during Reed's cattle thief trouble, Miller said as he measured fabric. Takes nerve to stand guard with a rifle when men are fighting outside. Takes common sense, Evelyn corrected. Mr. Reed taught me what to do. I simply did it. Still, Miller wrapped the fabric carefully. Not many women would keep their heads like that. My wife would have been hysterical. It was the closest thing to an apology Evelyn was likely to get from the man who'd allowed her to be mocked in his store. She accepted it with a nod and moved to examine the preserved goods, selecting jars of peaches and cherries that would supplement her own canning efforts. While Caleb loaded supplies into the wagon, Evelyn noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. Thomas Garrett, looking prosperous and comfortable. His arm linked with a young woman who must be his wife, Sarah. Evelyn's stomach clenched, but she held her ground, refusing to retreat or show weakness. Thomas saw her and faltered mid-step. His wife noticed his reaction and followed his gaze, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something harder. Evelyn. Thomas recovered his composure, though his voice carried uncertainty. I didn't know you were still in the area. Where else would I be, Thomas? Evelyn kept her voice level, aware that people were watching this encounter with fascinated attention. You invited me here. I came. The fact that you changed your mind about marrying me didn't change my situation. I tried to write, Thomas began, but his wife cut him off. No, you didn't. Sarah Garrett's voice was sharp. Don't lie to make yourself feel better, Thomas. You knew she was coming and you let her arrive anyway because you were too cowardly to tell her the truth. Thomas looked stricken. His wife looked furious. And Evelyn found herself in the surreal position of watching her former intended's marriage dissolve into argument in the middle of Red Willow's main street. Mrs. Garrett, Evelyn said quietly, your husband's choices are between you and him. They don't concern me anymore. They should concern you, Sarah replied, her anger not directed at Evelyn. You came all this way because he made you promises. He should have honored them, or at least had the decency to release you from them properly. He did release me, Evelyn said, by his actions, if not his words. And honestly, Mrs. Garrett, I think you saved me from a significant error in judgment. A man who handles difficult situations by avoidance and lies wouldn't have made a good husband. Sarah Garrett's expression shifted, some of the anger draining into something like reluctant kinship. No, she agreed. He wouldn't have. Thomas looked between the two women, clearly out of his depth. Sarah, can we please discuss this at home? We'll discuss it now, Sarah interrupted. Miss Hart, I owe you an apology. I knew Thomas was corresponding with someone back east. I chose to believe him when he said it was nothing serious, that you understood the situation. I was wrong to take his word without question. You loved him, Evelyn said simply. People make allowances for those they love. I would have done the same. Maybe. Sarah's jaw tightened. But love shouldn't require women to compromise their integrity or ignore obvious wrongs. I'm learning that lesson later than I should have. The tension in the exchange was thick enough to cut, and Evelyn saw Caleb approaching from the corner of her eye, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. But she held up a hand, stopping him. Mrs. Garrett, she said directly, I hope your marriage brings you happiness, genuinely. As for me, I've found employment and stability with Mr. Reed's household. I'm content with how things turned out, even if the path here was painful. Are you? Sarah asked, and the question seemed genuine rather than skeptical. Content, I mean? Evelyn considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, she would have said no. She was surviving, enduring, making the best of disaster. But now? Yes, she said, and realized it was true. I'm content. I'm doing work that matters, earning honest wages, contributing to something larger than myself. That's more than I had in Boston, and certainly more than I would have had in a marriage built on deception. Sarah nodded slowly. Then I'm glad for you. And perhaps someday I'll be able to say the same. She turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing awkwardly on the street. He opened his mouth as if to say something to Evelyn, but she'd already turned her back, done with him and the entire situation. Caleb helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they pulled away from Miller's general store with fresh supplies and the satisfaction of a confrontation handled with dignity. You all right? Caleb asked once they were clear of town. Better than all right? Evelyn replied. I think I just closed a chapter I didn't realize was still open. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking comfortably, the afternoon sun warm on Evelyn's shoulders. She thought about Sarah Garrett's anger at her husband, about Margaret Wilson's unexpected advocacy, about Miller's grudging respect. Red Willow was still a town that gossiped and judged, but it was also a town that could be navigated, managed, even conquered with patience and persistence. Are you going to attend Margaret's social? Caleb asked eventually. I think I might, Evelyn said, if for no other reason than to prove I'm not hiding or ashamed. You'll need time away from the ranch to do it. I can spare you Tuesday afternoon easily enough. Thank you. Evelyn glanced at him, this man who'd given her employment when she was desperate, who'd taught her to shoot and how to read weather patterns, who'd never once made her feel like his kindness came with conditions. For all of it. Not just the afternoon off, but everything. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Caleb's expression was hard to read. You've earned more than you've been given, Miss Hart. Your work alone is worth double what I'm paying you, and that's before considering how you handled yourself during the cattle thief incident. Then perhaps it's time to discuss a raise, Evelyn said, surprising herself with her boldness. Caleb laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Perhaps it is. Let's discuss it over supper tonight. Fair warning, though, the men will insist on being included in the negotiation. They've grown protective of their housekeeper. The word protective settled warmly in Evelyn's chest. She'd been tolerated in her aunt's house, useful in her teaching position, promised partnership by Thomas Garrett, but protected. That was new and more valuable than she'd realized. That evening, after a supper of fried chicken and fresh vegetables from the garden, Caleb raised the subject of Evelyn's wages. She'd expected a private conversation, but he brought it up at the table with all the men present. Miss Hart has pointed out that her work exceeds what we're paying her, Caleb said without preamble. I agree. She's transformed this household, improved our meals, maintained the property, and handled crisis situations with remarkable composure. I'm proposing we increase her wages from $30 to $40 a month, effective immediately. Make it 45, Dutch said gruffly. Haven't eaten this well in years, and the house hasn't been this clean since Sarah was alive. That's worth 45 easy. Agreed, Jack added. And we should discuss profit sharing if the cattle sales go as well as expected this fall. She's part of this operation now, should benefit when we all benefit. Evelyn stared at them, stunned. That's not necessary. It's absolutely necessary, Tommy interrupted quietly. You work as hard as any of us, Miss Hart. Harder in some ways. You should be compensated fairly. $45 a month and 5% of the fall cattle sale profits, Caleb said decisively. That's my final offer. Take it or leave it. I'll take it, Evelyn managed, her voice unsteady. Thank you, all of you. Don't thank us yet, Pete said with a grin. We're going to work you twice as hard now that we're paying you more. They all laughed, the easy camaraderie of people who'd learned to work together effectively, who'd survived danger as a unit, who'd become something more than employer and employees. They'd become a team, possibly even a family of sorts. Later that night, lying in her bed with the window open to let in cool mountain air, Evelyn calculated what the new wages meant. At $45 a month, she could save enough for passage back to Boston in less than 3 months. Add the profit sharing from cattle sales, and she'd have enough to not just return, but to start over completely, rent her own apartment, establish herself independently, never rely on anyone's charity again. The financial freedom was intoxicating, but so was the realization that she didn't particularly want to return to Boston anymore. The following Tuesday, Evelyn dressed in her best remaining Boston dress, slightly outdated but still respectable, and drove herself into town in the small wagon Caleb kept for light hauling. She'd baked 2 pies that morning, apple and cherry, and balanced them carefully on the seat beside her. The church social was already underway when she arrived. Women gathered in the church hall with coffee and conversation flowing freely. The room went quiet when Evelyn entered, every eye turning to assess the scandalous housekeeper who'd dared to attend. Margaret Wilson cut through the silence like a knife through butter. Evelyn, wonderful you came. Bring those pies over here. We're setting up the refreshment table. Ladies, this is Evelyn Hart, who manages the Reed household. Evelyn, this is everyone who matters in Red Willow, and several people who don't matter but showed up anyway. The casual introduction broke the tension, and several women laughed. Margaret guided Evelyn through a whirlwind of introductions. Ranchers' wives, the school teacher, the doctor's wife, the reverend's widow, women who ran businesses, and women who ran households. Some were warm, some were cool, but all of them were forced to acknowledge Evelyn's presence because Margaret had claimed her. Tell us about the cattle thieves, one woman said eagerly once the initial introductions were complete. My husband said there was quite a battle. Evelyn downplayed her own role, focusing instead on the men's courage and strategic thinking. But Margaret wouldn't let her deflect entirely. Don't be modest, Margaret said firmly. My sons told me you stood guard with a loaded rifle, had medical supplies ready, and didn't panic when shots were being fired. That's extraordinary. That's survival, Evelyn corrected. Mr. Reed taught me what to do. I simply did it. Most women wouldn't have, the Reverend's widow said quietly. My late husband always said the frontier needed women who could think clearly in crisis. You proved him right. The conversation shifted to other topics: upcoming harvest festivals, concerns about the new school curriculum, debate over whether the town needed a proper library. Evelyn contributed where she could, mostly listening and learning the social dynamics of Red Willow's female hierarchy. During a lull, the school teacher approached her privately. "I heard you taught music in Boston," she said. "We desperately need someone to teach piano to interested students. The previous teacher moved to Denver last spring. Would you consider it? Just a few hours a week, and the pay is modest but reliable." Evelyn felt her heart lift. Teaching again, using the skills she'd cultivated before ranch life consumed her days. "I'd need to discuss it with Mr. Reed," she said carefully. "Make sure it wouldn't interfere with my household responsibilities." "Of course. But if he agrees, we'd be grateful for your expertise." By the time Evelyn left the social 3 hours later, she'd been invited to join the Church Ladies' Charitable Society, asked to contribute recipes to a community cookbook being compiled, and offered the teaching position. She drove back to the ranch feeling like she'd won a small battle without having to fire a single shot. Caleb was on the porch when she arrived, ostensibly mending a bridle but clearly waiting for her return. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than expected," Evelyn admitted, climbing down from the wagon. "Margaret Wilson is formidable, and the school teacher offered me a teaching position, just a few hours a week, piano lessons for interested students." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd need to discuss it with you first." Evelyn sat on the porch steps, suddenly tired from the emotional weight of the afternoon. "I don't want to neglect my responsibilities here." "You won't," Caleb said. "If teaching a few hours a week makes you happy, we'll make it work. The men can fend for themselves for an afternoon or two." "Are you sure?" "Miss Hart, Evelyn." Caleb set aside his work and looked at her directly. "You've been here 4 months. In that time, you've transformed this ranch from a barely functional bachelor establishment into a real home. You've earned the right to make decisions about your own time, to pursue interests beyond housekeeping. If you want to teach, teach. If you want to join every ladies' society in the territory, do it. You're not a servant here. You're a valued member of this household with agency and choices." The use of her first name startled Evelyn more than the sentiment. They'd maintained formal address since she arrived, a professional distance that kept boundaries clear. But something had shifted today, or perhaps had been shifting for weeks, and she'd only now noticed. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, testing his name in her mouth. It felt natural, right? Like crossing a threshold she hadn't known existed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the barn, Dutch was singing an off-key song. Pete and Tommy were laughing about something near the corral. Jack was probably checking the horses one more time before calling it a night. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned when she boarded that stagecoach in Boston, not the partnership Thomas Garrett had promised, but something entirely her own. She'd built it from disaster and determination, from hard work and harder lessons. And standing here on the porch of the Triple R Ranch, watching the day end in spectacular color, Evelyn realized she wouldn't trade it for anything, not even for the dream she'd once carried in a trunk across 3,000 miles of frontier. Autumn arrived in the Colorado mountains with a violence that surprised Evelyn, even after months of frontier life. The aspens turned gold overnight, their leaves trembling in winds that carried the sharp promise of winter. Frost crept across the meadows each morning, turning grass to crystal that crunched underfoot. The men worked longer days preparing for winter, repairing buildings, stocking hay, moving cattle down from high pastures before the first serious snow trapped them. Evelyn's teaching had begun in September, 3 afternoons a week, in the small schoolhouse, where 5 students, ranging from a shy 7-year-old girl to the banker's teenage daughter, learned scales and simple compositions on an ancient upright piano. The work fed something in her soul that housekeeping, however satisfying, could not. When her fingers moved across the keys, demonstrating proper technique or playing examples from memory, she connected with the woman she'd been in Boston, the educated music teacher who'd had ambitions beyond survival. But she was no longer only that woman. She was also the ranch housekeeper who could shoot a rifle, preserve 100 jars of vegetables, manage accounts for a working cattle operation, and command the respect of hardened cowboys. The combination felt strange sometimes, like wearing two different dresses simultaneously, but it also felt complete in a way her Boston life never had. It was a Saturday morning in late October when everything changed. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing bread dough when Caleb entered through the back door, his expression troubled. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you spare a few minutes?" Evelyn wiped flour from her hands and followed him to the main room, where he gestured for her to sit. Her stomach tightened with undefined worry. In 8 months of working together, Caleb had never asked for a formal conversation like this. "Is something wrong?" she asked directly. "Not wrong, exactly. Complicated." Caleb sat across from her, his hands clasped between his knees. "I received a letter yesterday from my late wife's sister in St. Louis. She's been ill, needs someone to care for her, and has asked if I might consider moving there to help manage her affairs. She's quite wealthy, has no children, and she's hinting that she'd make me her heir if I came." Evelyn's heart dropped. "You're leaving the ranch?" "I don't want to," Caleb said immediately. "This place is everything Sarah and I built together, but family obligations are complicated, and Martha, that's her sister, she helped us when we were starting out. I owe her." "What does this mean for the ranch? For the men?" "For me," Evelyn thought, but didn't say. "That's what I need to discuss with you." Caleb leaned forward, his expression intense. "I've been thinking about this all night. If I go to St. Louis, I'd need someone to manage the ranch in my absence. Someone I trust completely. Someone who knows the operation. Someone the men will respect and follow." "Jack?" Evelyn said immediately. "He's your foreman. He knows ranching better than anyone." "Jack is brilliant with cattle and horses," Caleb agreed. "But he can't manage accounts, handle correspondence with buyers, negotiate contracts, or deal with the business side of running a ranch." "You can do all of that, Evelyn. You've been doing it for months." The implication took a moment to land. "You want me to manage the ranch?" "I want you to co-manage it with Jack," Caleb clarified. "He handles the livestock and land, you handle the business and household. Between the two of you, this place would run smoothly whether I'm here or not." "That's insane," Evelyn said flatly. "I'm a housekeeper. The town already gossips about me living here. If you leave and I'm suddenly running your ranch, the scandal would be nothing compared to letting this place fail because I was too worried about propriety to make smart decisions," Caleb interrupted. "Evelyn, you're the most competent person I know. You transformed this household. You stood your ground during the cattle thief attack. You've earned the respect of every man on this property. The only person who doesn't seem to realize how capable you are is you." Evelyn stood abruptly, needing to move, to think, to process what he was proposing. "How long would you be gone?" "I don't know. Months, certainly. Maybe a year. Martha's condition is serious. Consumption, the doctors think. She might recover, she might not. But I can't leave her to face it alone when she has no one else." "Of course you can't," Evelyn agreed. She understood family obligation, understood duty even when it conflicted with personal desire. "When would you leave?" "Within the month, if I go, before winter makes travel impossible." Caleb stood too, moving to the window where he could see the ranch spread below. "But I won't go unless I know this place is in good hands, and there are no hands I trust more than yours and Jack's." The compliment settled around Evelyn's shoulders like a weight and a gift simultaneously. She thought about the past 8 months, the terror of her first days, the gradual building of competence, the discovery that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Could she really manage a ranch? Even partially, even with Jack handling the physical labor? "I'd need more authority than I have now," she heard herself saying. "The men respect me in the kitchen, but managing the entire operation is different. They'd need to know I speak with your full backing." "You'd have it," Caleb said immediately. "I'd draw up legal documents giving you power of attorney for ranch business in my absence. Any decision you and Jack make together would be binding, and I'd increase your compensation significantly. You'd be earning a manager's salary, not a housekeeper's wages." "What about when you return?" "If you return," Evelyn forced herself to ask the harder question. "Do I go back to being just the housekeeper?" Caleb turned from the window to face her fully. "Is that what you want? To go back to just keeping house?" "I don't know what I want anymore," Evelyn admitted. 8 months ago, I wanted to be Thomas Garrett's wife, to teach music and raise children and live a respectable frontier life. Now I'm teaching piano while managing accounts for a cattle ranch, and somehow that feels more meaningful than anything I planned in Boston. Then maybe it's time to stop planning and start choosing, Caleb said quietly. You came here by accident, stayed out of necessity. But you've built something real, Evelyn. You've made yourself essential to this operation and this community. The question isn't what you wanted 8 months ago, it's what you want now. Before Evelyn could answer, the kitchen door banged open and Pete rushed in, his face flushed from riding hard. Boss, we've got trouble, he said urgently. Jack sent me. There's a man in town claiming he has prior claim to our north pasture, says he filed papers before you did, and the land is legally his. Caleb swore softly. Did Jack get a name? Vernon Kincaid. He's got a lawyer with him, official-looking documents. Miller said they're planning to file with the territorial court in Denver next week. Vernon Kincaid, Caleb repeated, his expression darkening. That's Snake. He tried to buy this land from me 3 years ago, offered half what it was worth. When I refused, he threatened to find a way to take it anyway. Can he do that? Evelyn asked. Claim land you've been ranching for years? If his papers predate mine and the territorial court accepts them, yes. Caleb was already moving toward his office, where he kept all ranch documents. Pete, ride back and tell Jack I'm coming to town within the hour. Evelyn, I need you to find my original land claim documents. They're in the safe. Combination is Sarah's birthday, 1853. We need to prove my claim is legitimate and filed properly. The next hours passed in controlled chaos. Evelyn found the documents, spread them across the dining table, and began cross-referencing dates and filing numbers against the ranch ledgers. Caleb rode to town with Jack, returning 3 hours later with grim news. Kincaid's documents look legitimate, he said, slumping into a chair. Filed in 1875, 2 months before mine. If they're genuine, he has legal claim to 800 acres of our best grazing land. Are they genuine? Evelyn asked, studying the papers Caleb had brought back. That's what we need to prove. The filing dates match territorial records, but something feels wrong. The signatures, the seal, something's off, but I can't put my finger on it. Evelyn pulled the documents closer, examining them with the careful attention she'd once applied to musical scores. Details mattered in both. A misplaced note could ruin a composition. A forged signature could steal a ranch. The seal is wrong, she said after several minutes of study. Look at the territorial stamp on your documents versus his. Yours has 13 stars in the border, his has 12. The territorial seal was updated in 1874 to reflect Colorado's application for statehood. It went from 12 to 13 stars. If his documents were really filed in 1875, they should have the 13-star seal. Caleb grabbed the papers, comparing them side by side. You're right. How did you notice that? I spent 6 months copying historical documents for my father before he died, Evelyn said. He was a lawyer, worked on territorial cases. He taught me that official seals change, and those changes can prove forgery. This is brilliant, Caleb said, excitement replacing exhaustion in his voice. If we can prove his documents are forged, the whole claim collapses. You need to get to Denver before he files, Evelyn said urgently. Take the documents to the territorial office. Show them the seal discrepancy. Get official confirmation that his papers are fraudulent. That's at least a week's journey, maybe more if weather turns, Caleb calculated. I'd have to leave immediately. Then leave immediately, Evelyn said. Jack and I can manage the ranch while you're gone. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. This is it, isn't it? The decision we were discussing this morning. If I go to Denver now, I might need to continue to St. Louis from there to see Martha. I could be gone for months. Then be gone for months, va? Evelyn said with more confidence than she felt. Save the ranch first. Help your sister-in-law second. Jack and I will keep things running here. You're sure? I'm terrified, Evelyn admitted. But I'm sure. Within 2 hours, Caleb was packed and riding toward Denver with the documents safely stored in his saddlebag. He'd gathered the men and explained the situation, made it clear that Evelyn and Jack had his full authority, and extracted promises of cooperation from everyone. Dutch had grumbled, but nodded. Tommy had simply said, "We'll follow Miss Hart's lead, boss." Pete had looked excited by the adventure of it all, and Jack had pulled Evelyn aside with quiet reassurance. "We've got this," he'd said. "You handle what you handle best. I'll handle what I handle best. Between us, Caleb's got nothing to worry about. But now, standing in the ranch yard watching Caleb disappear down the road toward Denver, Evelyn felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to. She was responsible for a 1,500-acre cattle ranch, 4 full-time employees, and a household that depended on her competence. If she failed, people lost their livelihoods. If she succeeded, she proved something about herself that she'd never been entirely sure was true. That night at supper, the dynamic was notably different with Caleb gone. The men looked to Evelyn for direction in a way they never had before. "What's the plan, Miss Hart?" Jack asked over coffee. Evelyn had spent the afternoon thinking about exactly that question. "We continue normal operations," she said firmly. "Jack, you manage the livestock and daily ranch work as you always do. I'll handle accounts, supplies, and anything requiring correspondence or negotiation. We make major decisions together, minor decisions independently in our own areas, and we keep everything running so smoothly that when Caleb returns, he can't find a single thing we mishandled." "What about Kincaid?" Dutch asked. "He's going to notice Caleb's gone, might try something." "Let him try," Evelyn said. "We have legal documents proving our claim is legitimate, and we have 5 people living on this property who won't be intimidated. If Kincaid has a problem, he can take it up with the territorial court when they reject his forged papers." The men nodded, satisfied with her answer. After supper, Jack stayed behind to discuss the next week's work schedule. Cattle to move, fences to check, hay to store before snow came. "You're handling this well," he observed as they reviewed the ranch ledger together. "Better than most people would in your position." "I'm pretending to handle it well," Evelyn corrected. "Inside, I'm terrified I'll make a mistake that costs everyone everything." "That's called being responsible," Jack said. "The people who aren't scared of making mistakes usually make the biggest ones." The days that followed established a new rhythm. Evelyn rose before dawn, made breakfast, then spent mornings managing ranch business, reviewing accounts, ordering supplies, handling correspondence with cattle buyers interested in fall stock. Afternoons were dedicated to household tasks and her teaching commitments in town. Evenings were spent going over the day's work with Jack, planning for tomorrow, solving problems as they arose. She discovered she was good at it, not just competent, but genuinely skilled at managing the complex web of decisions that kept a ranch functioning. When a supplier in Denver tried to overcharge for winter feed, she negotiated a better price by threatening to take her business to his competitor. When 2 of the ranch hands got into a dispute over work assignments, she mediated fairly and established clear expectations for both. When an early snowstorm threatened cattle in the high pasture, she coordinated with Jack to move them to safety without losing a single head. The town noticed. Women at her piano lessons commented on how well the ranch seemed to be running in Caleb's absence. Miller at the general store treated her with new respect when she came to settle accounts. Even the bank manager, previously dismissive, listened carefully when she discussed ranch finances. November brought Caleb's first letter from Denver. The territorial office had confirmed the seal discrepancy, declared Kincaid's documents fraudulent, and dismissed his claim entirely. Kincaid was facing charges for attempted land fraud, and his lawyer had abandoned him. The ranch's northern pasture was secure, legally confirmed, and the threat was over. But Caleb wasn't coming back immediately. His sister-in-law, Martha's condition had worsened, and she'd begged him to come to St. Louis. He was leaving Denver within the week, would be in Missouri by Christmas, and had no clear timeline for return. "I trust you and Jack completely," his letter concluded. "Run the ranch as you see fit. Make decisions you believe are right. I'll support whatever you choose. And Evelyn, thank you for everything you've done, everything you are, everything you've become. You're remarkable, and I hope someday you'll believe that as fully as I do." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, her heart doing complicated things she didn't want to examine too closely. Caleb's absence had created space for her to grow into leadership, but it had also created space for her to realize how much she'd come to rely on his steady presence, his quiet confidence, his unwavering belief in her abilities. She missed him. Not as an employer, not even as a friend exactly, but as something more that she couldn't quite name. Winter descended with serious intent in December. Snow piled 3 feet deep in the valleys, 5 feet in drifts against buildings. The men worked in shifts, keeping paths clear, caring for livestock sheltered in barns, breaking ice on water troughs. Evelyn kept the house warm, the food plentiful, and morale high despite the bitter cold and Caleb's continued absence. Christmas came and went quietly. The men pooled resources to give Evelyn a new winter coat, practical, warm, and so thoughtful it made her cry. She gave them each hand-knitted scarves and mittens, made them a special dinner with all their favorite foods, and taught Pete Christmas carols on harmonica while the others sang along badly but enthusiastically. It was the best Christmas Evelyn had ever experienced, not because of gifts or luxury, but because of genuine affection freely given and received. These rough cowboys had become her family in ways her blood relatives never had. Caleb's letters arrived sporadically throughout the winter, each one bringing updates on Martha's slow recovery and reassurance that the ranch remained his priority despite the distance. He asked detailed questions about operations, offered suggestions when requested, and praised every decision Evelyn and Jack described. The letters were professional, friendly, but carefully appropriate, nothing that suggested his feelings were anything but respectful employer to capable employee. Evelyn told herself she was relieved. Anything else would complicate an already complex situation. But late at night, when the wind howled around the ranch house and she sat alone with his letters, she allowed herself to wonder what might happen when he finally returned. Spring arrived in late March with dramatic suddenness. Snow melted in rushing torrents, flooding creeks and turning pastures to mud. The men worked from dawn to dusk, managing the chaos of seasonal change, and Evelyn coordinated everything from supplies to veterinary care for livestock struggling through calving season. It was a warm April afternoon when she saw a rider approaching from the south. Her heart jumped before her mind identified the figure. Caleb, returning after 6 months away, looking weathered and weary, but unmistakably himself. The men saw him too and came running from various parts of the ranch. Evelyn stood on the porch, suddenly uncertain of her role in this reunion. She was the housekeeper, the temporary manager, the woman who'd kept his ranch running but had no permanent claim to any part of his life. Caleb dismounted stiffly, greeted the men with handshakes and backslaps, asked rapid questions about the stock and the land. But his eyes kept finding Evelyn on the porch, and finally he walked toward her while the men discreetly dispersed. "Miss Hart," he said formally, stopping at the porch steps. "Mr. Reed," she replied, matching his tone. "Welcome home. It's good to be back." He climbed the steps slowly, as if his body ached from long travel. "The place looks incredible. Better than when I left." "Jack and I did our best." "You did more than your best. I read every report you sent, every decision you documented. You didn't just maintain the ranch, Evelyn. You improved it." He paused, seeming to gather courage for something difficult. "Can we talk? Privately?" Evelyn nodded and led him inside to the main room. The house was spotless, as always, with fresh bread cooling on the counter and coffee ready on the stove. Normal domestic details that suddenly felt charged with significance. Caleb sat at the table where they'd shared hundreds of meals, where she'd first agreed to work for him 8 months ago in desperate circumstances neither could have predicted would lead here. "Martha died 3 weeks ago," he said without preamble, peacefully, with me there. "She left me everything, her house, her investments, enough money that I'll never need to worry about finances again." "I'm sorry for your loss," Evelyn said quietly. "Thank you. I am too, though honestly we weren't close. But she was Sarah's sister, and I owed her the comfort of not dying alone." Caleb took a breath. "The thing is, Evelyn, I could sell this ranch tomorrow, take Martha's money, move to St. Louis, live comfortably in her mansion doing absolutely nothing for the rest of my life." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Is that what you want?" "No," he said immediately. "This ranch is my life. The work Sarah and I started together. I can't imagine leaving it. But I also can't imagine running it the way I used to, alone, managing everything myself, carrying all the weight." "You have Jack," Evelyn reminded him. "I have Jack for the livestock and land," Caleb agreed. "But I need someone for everything else. Someone who understands business and accounts and negotiation. Someone who can make hard decisions and stand by them. Someone who loves this place and these people enough to fight for them." He met her eyes directly. "I need you, Evelyn. Not as my housekeeper. As my partner. My full partner in every aspect of running this ranch." The word partner hung between them, weighted with possibility. "What exactly are you proposing?" Evelyn asked carefully. I'm proposing we formalize what you've already been doing. You become co-owner of the Triple R Ranch with legal rights and financial stake equal to mine. We run this place together, make decisions together, share profits and losses equally. You'd have security, independence, and the authority you've already proven you can handle responsibly. It was a generous offer, shockingly so, but Evelyn found herself asking the question that really mattered. Is that all you're proposing? A business partnership? Caleb's expression shifted, became more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. That's all I'm proposing right now, because I won't put pressure on you, won't make you feel obligated beyond what you genuinely want. But Evelyn, I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope for more eventually. You're the strongest, most capable, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Somewhere in the past 8 months, my respect for you became something deeper. If you felt even a fraction of that, if someday you might consider... He stopped, shook his head. But that's for later, if ever. Right now I'm offering partnership. The rest can unfold naturally or not at all. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had become her home, her purpose, her future. She thought about the woman who'd arrived here 8 months ago, desperate, humiliated, with nothing but $23 and determination. She thought about who that woman had become, strong, competent, respected, free. She thought about Caleb's steady faith in her, Jack's quiet loyalty, the men's protective affection. She thought about teaching piano in town, growing vegetables in her garden, managing accounts and making decisions that mattered. She thought about the life she'd built from disaster, the person she'd discovered in herself when necessity demanded it. And she thought about the future Caleb was offering, true partnership, legal equality, and maybe someday something more if they both chose it freely. I accept, she said, turning to face him. The partnership, the co-ownership, all of it. On one condition. Name it. We draw up proper legal documents. I want everything in writing, ownership percentages, profit sharing, decision-making authority. I won't build my life on promises again, Caleb. I need contracts and security and legal protection. Done, he said immediately. We'll ride to town tomorrow, have the lawyer draw up everything properly. You'll have every protection and guarantee in writing. Then yes, Evelyn said, and felt something unlock in her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but possibility. I'll be your partner. Caleb stood and extended his hand formally. Evelyn took it, and they shook on the agreement that would change both their lives. But neither of them let go immediately, and in that extended moment of contact, Evelyn felt the promise of more than business partnership hovering just beyond what either was ready to claim. There's one more thing, Caleb said quietly. The men have been asking when you'll stop being Miss Hart and just be Evelyn. They think the formality is ridiculous after everything we've been through together. The men have been asking? Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Or you have? A slight smile tugged at Caleb's mouth. Maybe it's a collective question. Then tell the men and yourself that I'll be Evelyn when you stop being Mr. Reed and start being Caleb. Deal, he said, and finally released her hand. The legal documents were drawn up within a week, comprehensive, detailed, protecting Evelyn's rights and stake in the ranch with ironclad certainty. She became, officially and legally, co-owner of the Triple R Ranch with all the authority and financial benefits that entailed. The town talked, of course. A woman owning half a major cattle ranch was scandalous enough. A woman who'd arrived as a rejected mail-order bride now partnering with the man who'd employed her was gossip for months. But Margaret Wilson silenced most criticism with a pointed observation at the church social. Evelyn Hart has proven herself more capable than most men in this territory, she'd said loudly enough for everyone to hear. If you're more concerned with propriety than competence, that says more about your judgment than hers. Summer brought prosperity. The cattle sales exceeded expectations, and Evelyn's careful financial management meant the ranch was more profitable than it had been in years. She and Caleb fell into easy partnership. He handled physical operations, she handled business affairs, and they consulted each other on everything significant. They were colleagues, friends, and something more that neither rushed to define. It was a warm evening in late August when Caleb found Evelyn in her garden, harvesting tomatoes as the sun set behind the mountains. "Can I help?" he asked. Can you tell a ripe tomato from an almost ripe one? Evelyn challenged. I'm a rancher, not an idiot, Caleb said, kneeling beside her. I think I can manage tomatoes. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes before Caleb spoke again. It's been a year, he said quietly, since you arrived in Red Willow. I know. Evelyn had been thinking about that milestone herself. Seems both longer and shorter somehow. Do you ever regret it? Coming here, staying, everything that happened? Evelyn considered the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been desperate and humiliated, rejected publicly, forced to accept employment out of pure necessity. Now she co-owned a successful ranch, taught music to eager students, had respect and security and genuine friendship. She'd become someone she could never have been in Boston. Strong, independent, unafraid. No, she said honestly. I don't regret any of it. Even the painful parts led somewhere good. I'm glad, Caleb said. Then, more hesitantly, Evelyn, I know we agreed to let things develop naturally, no pressure, no expectations. But I need you to know something. What's that? I love you. The words were simple, direct, without artifice. Not as my business partner, not as my housekeeper, not as the capable woman who saved my ranch. I love you for who you are. Your strength, your intelligence, your stubborn refusal to quit even when everything seemed hopeless. I love the way you teach piano with such patience, the way you argue with Dutch about politics, the way you check the garden every evening even when you're exhausted. I love you, and I have for months, and I needed you to know that even if you don't feel the same. Evelyn set down her basket of tomatoes and looked at him, this good man who'd given her chance after chance, who'd believed in her when she barely believed in herself, who'd offered partnership without conditions and love without demands. I do feel the same, she said quietly. I think I have for a while, but I was afraid to acknowledge it. Afraid it would complicate our partnership. Afraid you still loved Sarah too much to have room for someone else. Afraid I'd end up hurt again, like I was with Thomas. I did love Sarah, Caleb said honestly. Part of me always will. But she's gone, and life continues, and she would want me to be happy. She'd like you, Evelyn. She'd admire what you've built here, the strength you've shown. She wouldn't want me spending the rest of my life alone out of loyalty to a memory. I'm not asking you to forget her, Evelyn assured him. I'm just asking if there's room in your heart for someone new. There's room, Caleb said, if you want to fill it. Evelyn reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his in a gesture that was both new and familiar. I want to try, slowly, carefully, without rushing into anything. But yes, Caleb, I want to try. He smiled, genuine and warm and full of hope. Slowly and carefully sounds perfect. They finished harvesting tomatoes as the last light faded from the sky, talking about small things and large ones, making plans for the ranch's future and acknowledging the possibility of their own future together. It wasn't a proposal, wasn't even a formal commitment, but it was a beginning. The months that followed were the happiest Evelyn had ever known. She and Caleb continued their partnership in the ranch, but added layers of personal connection that deepened gradually into something solid and real. They took walks together in the evenings, sat on the porch sharing coffee and conversation, rode out to check distant pastures, and talked about dreams beyond immediate survival. By Christmas, when Caleb asked her to marry him, properly, with a ring he'd had custom-made in Denver and a speech he'd clearly practiced, Evelyn's answer was immediate and certain. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. They married in early spring in a simple ceremony at the Red Willow Church, with all the ranch hands in attendance and half the town watching. Margaret Wilson cried openly. Dutch complained that his back hurt, but his eyes were suspiciously wet. Jack stood as Caleb's best man and whispered to Evelyn before she walked down the aisle, Sarah would be happy for both of you. Evelyn wore a new dress. Not the wedding gown she'd sewn for Thomas Garrett, which she'd donated to the church charity months ago, but a beautiful blue silk that Margaret had insisted on buying for her. It felt right, this new dress for a new beginning, leaving the old dreams behind for reality that surpassed them. As she stood beside Caleb and made vows that this time meant everything, Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Colorado as a mail-order bride seeking security through marriage. She'd found it instead through her own competence, her own strength, her own refusal to let disaster define her future. She'd been rejected, humiliated, left with nothing but determination and $23. From that wreckage, she'd built a life that was entirely her own, earned through work, proven through crisis, secured through legal partnership before being blessed through love. The woman who'd stood in Miller's general store a year and a half ago, watching her dreams shatter, would barely recognize the woman Evelyn had become. That frightened girl had needed rescue. This strong, capable woman standing in the church had rescued herself and found partnership instead of dependency, equality instead of obligation. When Caleb kissed her at the end of the ceremony, sealing vows freely chosen rather than desperately accepted, Evelyn felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. This was what she'd been seeking without knowing it. Not a husband to save her, but a partner to build alongside. And the discovery that she was strong enough to stand alone even as she chose to stand together. The years that followed were full and rich. The Triple R Ranch thrived under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Evelyn continued teaching piano, became involved in territorial education initiatives, and eventually helped establish a proper library in Red Willow. She and Caleb had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah for the woman whose suffering had ultimately led to Evelyn's salvation, and a son they called James, who had his father's steady nature and his mother's stubborn determination. The town that had once mocked her as a rejected mail-order bride came to respect her as a businesswoman, educator, and pillar of the community. When Colorado achieved statehood, Evelyn was invited to serve on committees discussing women's property rights and educational access. The frightened woman who'd arrived with nothing had become someone whose opinion mattered, whose voice carried weight, whose life proved that disaster could become foundation rather than ending. And through it all, the Triple R remained her anchor, the place where she'd learned her own strength, discovered her capabilities, and built a life that was wholly, completely, triumphantly her own. Not because a man promised her one through letters, but because she'd created it herself from determination, competence, and the unwillingness to let broken promises break her spirit. On summer evenings, when work was done and children were sleeping, Evelyn and Caleb would sit on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked about ranch business or town politics or plans for tomorrow. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, content just to be together. And sometimes Evelyn would think about that trunk she'd brought from Boston, full of hopes that hadn't materialized and a wedding dress she'd never worn for its intended purpose. She'd been so certain about what she wanted then, so convinced that Thomas Garrett's promises were her path to happiness. She'd been wrong, completely, providentially wrong. And that wrongness had led her here, to this porch, this ranch, this life, this man, this version of herself that was stronger and freer and more fully alive than any version she'd imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb would ask when he caught that particular expression on her face. "How glad I am that Thomas Garrett rejected me," Evelyn would answer honestly. And Caleb would laugh and pull her close, and they'd watch the stars emerge over the Colorado mountains, grateful for the broken promises that had led them both exactly where they needed to be. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected in a frontier store had become a ranch owner, a teacher, a mother, a respected community leader, and a woman who'd proven that the best partnerships are built on equality rather than rescue, on choice rather than necessity, on love freely given rather than desperately sought. And every day, in 100 small ways, Evelyn chose this life again. Not because she had no other options, but because she'd learned something Thomas Garrett's letters never taught her. The only person who could truly save her was herself. Everything else was just partnership, freely chosen and joyfully maintained. And that made all the difference.